In thousands of American homes in the 1950s, there was a photograph that was never taken and a child who was never in the frame. Somewhere in a drawer, in an attic box, in the back pages of an album bound in cracked leather, there is a family portrait with a gap in it. Not a torn corner, not a missing page. A gap shaped exactly like a person, left there on purpose and never spoken of again. The mother in the photograph is smiling the practiced smile of the era, chin lifted, hands folded. The father stands with his weight settled back on his heels, the way men stood for cameras then, as if daring the picture to find fault with him. The children are arranged by height, the way children always were, smallest at the front in dresses starched hard enough to stand on their own. Count them. Now find the birth certificate that says there should be one more. That missing child did not vanish. In many cases, she was 2 miles away, or 20, or 200, in a building with a name like a school and a population like a small city, and she would go on living for years, sometimes for the rest of a very long life, without ever appearing in a photograph again. It happened quietly enough that most of the neighbors never knew. It happened often enough that statistically, if your own family has old photograph albums from this decade, there is a real and documented chance that somewhere in those pages a corner has been trimmed a little too carefully, a little too deliberately to have been an accident of framing. This is a story about the children who were edited out of their own families, not by cruelty alone, though there was cruelty in it, not by simple neglect, though neglect played its part too. It happened, more often than we like to admit, on the advice of kind-faced doctors in rooms that smelled of antiseptic and good intentions, to parents who were told, gently, that this was simply what a loving family did. Settle in. There is nothing here that will keep you awake with fear. Only a quiet unearthing, told slowly, the way old photographs are found, one drawer at a time, in no particular hurry, by someone who has already decided to be gentle with what they find. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The 1950s in America wore a very particular face in public. It was the decade of the record player and the good china, of families photographed on porch steps in their Sunday clothes, of a certain performed wholesomeness that magazines sold and mothers bought whether they could afford it or not. We remember it now through that filtered light, casseroles, drive-in movies, a father coming home to a lit porch. What that filtered light leaves out is this. It was also the decade in which more American children were removed from their families and placed into institutions for the disabled than in almost any decade before or since. Historians who have gathered family oral history since have found the same story again and again, told in kitchens, in nursing homes, in letters written by adult siblings who only learned the truth decades later. A baby is born. Something is different about the baby. A missing chromosome, a difficult birth, a slower unfolding of the milestones every young mother is handed a checklist for. A doctor, speaking with the calm certainty doctors were trained to project in that era, tells the parents something like this. It would be better for everyone, better for the other children, better even for the baby. There are places, the doctor says, built for exactly this. Clean places, staffed places, places where the child will be cared for by people who understand these things far better than a tired young mother ever could. And so it happened. Sometimes within days of the birth, sometimes the mother was still recovering in the hospital bed when the papers were brought to her husband to sign, and she never held that child at all. The family went home, the crib was quietly taken down, and in the photograph taken at the christening of the next baby, or the birthday of an older sibling, there is simply one fewer child than the birth records of that family would suggest there should be. One quiet reminder before we go further into their story. This video, along with the rest of our full library of sleep stories, is also available as an audiobook on Spotify if you would rather just close your eyes and listen. The link for that is down in the description or pinned in the comments. This is not a story about villains, or at least not simple ones. Most of the parents in this story loved their children fiercely, in the particular anguished way that grief-stricken love sometimes gets, before it curdles into resignation. Most of the doctors believed sincerely that they were offering mercy. The institutions themselves were often founded decades earlier by people who imagined they were building something humane, asylums in the old and gentler sense of that word, a place of refuge rather than exile. What happened to that founding intention over the years and the underfunding and the overcrowding that followed is a story we will walk through slowly and without flinching, but also without cruelty of our own toward anyone in it. What we are really telling tonight is a story about photographs, about the specific, deliberate work of editing a person out of a family's visible history, cropping them from group pictures, leaving them off the Christmas card list, telling younger siblings born after the fact that they were an only child, or the third of three, when they were in truth the fourth of four. About what it does to a family to carry a secret shaped exactly like a person for 20, 30, sometimes 50 years, and about what happened much later when some of those secrets finally came apart. You do not need to hold any of this too tightly. Let it arrive the way an old photograph arrives when you finally open that box in the attic. A little dust, a little surprise, and then, slowly, understanding. We will move gently through a nursery in 1953, through a doctor's office with dark wood paneling, through the long, clean hallway of a state institution, and through the quiet kitchens of the parents who lived with what they had agreed to. There is sorrow in this story, yes, but there is also, if you let it settle, something like grace. Because at the very end, some of these families found their way back to each other. Not all, but some. It is worth being honest too about what kind of story this is not. It is not a story built to shock you or to catalogue cruelty for its own sake. Nearly every family in this history was doing the best they understood how to do, inside a system that had already made most of their choices for them long before they ever sat down in that consultation room. Where the system failed, and it failed often and badly, we will look at it honestly. But we will look at the people inside that system, on every side of it, with the same gentleness we would want extended to our own families, making difficult decisions inside their own difficult era. For now, let the evening close in around you. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been holding on all day. We begin, as these stories often do, in a small bedroom painted the pale yellow that was fashionable that year, in the early spring of 1953. You are standing in a nursery that smells of fresh paint, the pale butter yellow that furniture catalogues of the era called Sunshine, chosen because it suited either a boy or a girl, and the young mother 2 doors down had recommended the exact brand. The crib is white iron, second-hand but sanded and repainted until it looked new. A mobile of felt ducklings turns very slowly above it, moved by nothing more than the draft from a cracked window. This is where the story usually begins, in a room like this one, in a house like 1,000 others built in the building boom that followed the war. Small, square, efficient. A young family's first real home, bought with a loan backed by the government and furnished slowly, one paycheck at a time. The birth itself happens the way most births of that decade happened, in a hospital, with the father pacing a waiting room several floors away, forbidden by hospital policy from coming any closer. He will smoke through most of a pack of cigarettes before a nurse finally appears to tell him whether he has a son or a daughter. He will not, in that first hour, be told anything more complicated than that. It is often the delivery room nurses who notice first, a particular looseness in the muscle tone, a fold of skin at the inner corner of each eye that catches the light differently than expected, a stillness in the newborn's cry that seasoned nurses learn over years to hear as different from an ordinary quiet baby. They do not say anything to the mother in that first hour. There is a protocol for this, unwritten but well understood, and it does not involve the mother finding out from a nurse. It is worth pausing here on something easy to forget. In 1953, there was no reliable blood test for the most common chromosomal difference behind these diagnoses. The genetic cause would not even be identified by researchers for another 6 years. Everything a doctor believed about your baby in that hospital room, he believed from looking, from decades of clinical pattern recognition, and from a body of medical literature that was, by the standards we would apply today, startlingly thin and startlingly certain of itself at the same time. The obstetrician comes to see the father first, not the mother. This too was custom. He speaks in the low, measured voice doctors were trained to use for difficult conversations, a voice built to convey competence more than warmth. He uses the clinical vocabulary of the day, Words that would be considered offensive within a few decades, but that were, in 1953, simply the entries in the medical textbooks sitting on his own office shelf. He explains, gently but without much room for negotiation, that the baby shows the physical markers of a specific and well-documented condition. He explains that children with this condition rarely live past their 20s. He explains, and this is the sentence that will echo through the rest of this family's life, that the kindest thing for everyone, including the baby, would be a clean and immediate placement before the mother has had the chance to nurse the child, before what he calls delicately an unbreakable attachment can form. Here is the first fact worth sitting with tonight. This advice was not the fringe opinion of one unusually cold physician. It was, through most of the 1950s, close to the standard recommendation taught in American medical schools and printed in the pediatric guidance manuals doctors kept on their desks. An entire generation of physicians was trained to treat institutionalization not as a last resort, but as the responsible first recommendation. The father listens standing up because sitting down has not occurred to him. He asks very few questions. It is not that he does not love the child he has not yet been allowed to hold. It is that everything about the moment, the white coat, the dark wood paneling of the consultation room, the framed medical degree on the wall, has been built across an entire career and an entire institution of American medicine to produce exactly this response: trust, deference, agreement. He is handed a pamphlet. It has a name like Sunny Acres or Fairview or Pleasant View, one of the softened, almost apologetic names that state institutions of the era favoured, names chosen by boards who understood, on some level, that the true nature of the place needed a gentler door to walk through. The mother, still in her hospital bed 2 floors up, will not be told any of this until the following morning. When she is told, she will ask to see the baby. She will be told, kindly, that this is not advisable. Some hospitals of the era went further still, arranging for mother and newborn never to be in the same room together at all, a practice quietly justified in the hospital's own language as being for the mother's protection. It is difficult from where we sit now to imagine agreeing to something like this, but you are not sitting where she was sitting. You have not just given birth. You have not been awake for 30 hours. You have not had every person in a position of authority in that room, doctor, husband, hospital chaplain, summoned for exactly this purpose, tell you in the same calm voice that the loving thing, the responsible thing, the thing a good mother does, is to let go. Somewhere in the paperwork that afternoon, a single form needs a single signature, and it is very often the father's signature alone, not the mother's, that the hospital requests, because he is the one who was consulted, and because the culture of the time considered this too simply the natural order of decisions in a family. By evening, arrangements have already begun. A social worker from the state institution, or sometimes simply a hospital administrator acting as go-between, is contacted. A date is set, usually within the week, sometimes within days. The crib at home, painted white and waiting, will sit empty. Nobody in that little house with the fresh yellow paint yet knows how long it will stay that way, or that in some cases it never gets used for that child again at all. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house in the days after a decision like this is made. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of people carefully not discussing something, moving around each other in the kitchen with an unusual, deliberate gentleness, as though the whole house has been asked to hold its breath. The mother comes home from the hospital to a nursery that is, for the moment, still fully furnished, still smelling of fresh paint, still turning its felt ducklings very slowly in the draught. She will, in the coming weeks, quietly begin to take it apart. The mobile first. Then the small stack of receiving blankets, given away to a cousin expecting her own baby that autumn. The crib last of all, because taking down a crib is the kind of task that asks something of a person that grief has not yet made them ready to give. None of this made the newspapers. None of it appeared in any public record beyond a hospital chart and later an institutional intake file. It happened quietly, one house at a time, in bedrooms painted the fashionable colours of 1953, in a decade that would remember itself publicly for its optimism. It is worth noticing, too, what the young mother in this story was surrounded by in those first days home from the hospital. Not silence exactly, but a very particular kind of solicitous busyness. Neighbors bringing casseroles they would ordinarily have brought to celebrate a birth, now delivered with a slightly different, quieter tone. A sister-in-law offering to take the older children for the afternoon, so the house could be, as she put it gently, a little easier for a while. Everyone around her behaving as though something significant had happened, while very few of them said, out loud, exactly what that something was. The husband, for his part, often returned to work within days, the way men of the era generally did after any domestic upheaval, expected by custom and by their own employers to carry on with visible steadiness regardless of what was happening at home. Several accounts gathered from surviving letters of the period describe these fathers as outwardly composed at the office and visibly altered at home, a private grief carried quietly behind the same measured, unhurried manner the family doctor had modelled for them in that first consultation. There is also, in a number of these family accounts, a detail worth sitting with about the earliest days, specifically the mother's own recovering body, still healing from childbirth, moving through a house being quietly dismantled around her, taking down a crib, giving away a stack of receiving blankets, folding closed a chapter that had barely had the chance to open, all while her own body was still doing the ordinary, unglamorous work of recovering from labour. Grief and physical recovery in these accounts arrived tangled together in a way that made it difficult, even for the mother herself, to say afterward where one had ended and the other begun. There is one more quiet fact worth including here, easy to overlook amid the larger sweep of this history. Hospital social workers of this era, where a facility employed one at all, were themselves operating from training manuals and institutional guidelines that treated rapid referral to state institutional care as a core, expected part of their job description in exactly these circumstances, rather than one option among several to be weighed carefully with a family. The social worker, who appeared at this family's door within days of the birth, was not, in other words, freelancing an unusually harsh recommendation. She was following a script that had been handed to her in turn by an entire professional field that had settled, decades earlier, on institutionalization as its default and expected answer. We will follow this family a little further tonight, and others like them, but let this first image settle for a moment before we move on. A room painted yellow, a mobile of felt ducklings turning slowly above a crib no one yet knows will stand empty. To understand what it meant in the 1950s to be edited out of a family photograph, it helps to understand what photography itself meant to families in this particular decade, because it meant something quite specific and quite new. The affordable home camera had, by the early 1950s, become common enough that the family snapshot was no longer the rare, formal occasion it had been for earlier generations, reserved for a single trip to a studio photographer once every few years. A simple box camera, inexpensive and easy enough for almost anyone in the household to operate, sat in a kitchen drawer in a great many homes, brought out for birthdays, holidays, first days of school, ordinary Sunday afternoons that felt, in the moment, worth preserving. This shift mattered enormously for how families of this era came to think about their own visual record. A photograph was no longer simply a formal document, commissioned occasionally and treated with corresponding solemnity. It had become something closer to an ongoing diary, accumulated steadily across years, pasted into albums with black paper pages and small triangular corner mounts, captioned underneath in a parent's careful handwriting, a name, a date, sometimes a small note about the occasion. It is worth understanding, too, how socially significant these albums became within a community. Neighbours and relatives visiting a home were often invited as a matter of ordinary hospitality to look through the family album together in the evening, the images functioning as a kind of shared conversation piece, a way of catching visiting relatives up on milestones they had missed, of demonstrating, gently and without needing to say so directly, that a family was thriving, growing, keeping up appearances that mattered enormously in an era when a family's respectability was measured, in no small part, by exactly this kind of visible, presentable ordinariness. Against this backdrop, the specific act of editing a child out of this ongoing visual diary takes on an even sharper significance than it might otherwise carry. It was not simply the removal of a single formal portrait, commissioned once and then quietly not repeated. It was an ongoing, active labour, repeated across years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sunday afternoons, choosing again and again, photograph after photograph, occasion after occasion, to maintain a version of the family story that did not include a particular child. Studio photography, though gradually less common than the home snapshot, still played an important role for the most significant family occasions. A milestone birthday, a wedding, a formal annual portrait some families commissioned specifically for sending out with holiday cards. These studio sessions required scheduling in advance, which meant they also required, on the part of a family managing this particular secret, a small ongoing act of planning. Which children would attend the sitting? Which season would be chosen? How the resulting portrait would be composed so that its absence is read to any outside viewer as simply the natural and complete shape of an ordinary family rather than as evidence of anyone missing. There is a particular kind of skill visible, in retrospect, in how carefully many of these families managed this ongoing task, a skill that had nothing to do with photography itself and everything to do with a kind of exhausting, sustained emotional labor that fell, in most documented cases, primarily to mothers. Deciding what to say if a photographer asked casually how many children the family had, deciding how to answer a distant relative's letter inquiring after the new baby, deciding year after year how to keep the story consistent enough that no one, including the family's own younger children, would ever have reason to notice the gap. Photography of this era also, in its own quiet way, reinforced a broader cultural ideal that made this particular kind of concealment feel, to many parents, less like deception and more like simple discretion. Magazines and advertisements of the decade presented an idealized, remarkably uniform image of the American family: 2 parents, several healthy children, a station wagon in the driveway, an entirely visible and entirely presentable domestic life. Families living with any significant difficulty, disability among them, but certainly not limited to it, often felt, correctly, that the surrounding culture offered very little visible space for anything that did not match that idealized picture, and adjusted their own visible record accordingly. It is against this specific cultural backdrop, a decade uniquely invested in the visible, photographable performance of family wholesomeness, that tonight's larger story finds its sharpest edges. The families we have been following were not simply keeping a private sorrow private in the ordinary way families have always kept certain things to themselves. They were actively managing an entire visual record built photograph by photograph across years to align with an ideal that their actual family, through no fault of anyone in it, no longer entirely matched. Photography shops themselves became, in this small way, unwitting witnesses to this history. A local drugstore or camera shop, developing roll after roll of family film across the years, might have quietly noticed a family's shifting cast of faces without ever having any particular reason to remark on it. One more small, invisible node in a much larger, unspoken national pattern that no single observer in any single town ever had the vantage point to see whole. It is worth noting, as a small final point in this chapter, that this same photographic culture would eventually play a quiet role in undoing exactly the kind of concealment it had once made easier to sustain. The very habit of documenting ordinary family life so thoroughly, year after year, meant that these families left behind an unusually rich paper and photographic trail, one that later researchers, genealogists, and adult children would draw on directly decades afterward in the patient work of piecing this history back together. We return now to that same small house, some months further along than where we left it, to look more closely at exactly how this particular editing work was carried out and at what it cost the person doing it. Before we go further into the story of one family, it helps to understand the wider world they were living inside, a world with its own vocabulary, its own legal machinery, and its own decades of accumulated assumptions, all of it already in motion long before that particular baby was born in that particular yellow room. By the 1950s, American medicine had inherited a classification system for intellectual disability that was several generations old, built by early psychologists testing the newly invented tools of intelligence measurement. Children were sorted into tiers with clinical names that sound almost archaic to us now, tiers based largely on a single number produced by a single test administered often to a frightened child in an unfamiliar room by an unfamiliar adult with a stopwatch. This is worth pausing on. The intelligence tests used to make lifelong institutionalization decisions in this era were the same tests, largely unmodified, that had been developed decades earlier and had already been criticized, even at the time, for cultural bias and unreliability in young children. A single difficult morning, a child's shyness with strangers, an undiagnosed hearing difficulty, any of these could shift a score enough to change which door a child's whole life walked through. The legal scaffolding underneath all of this was older still. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court had upheld the forced sterilization of a young woman in a state institution, in a ruling whose author closed his opinion with a sentence that would echo through public health policy for the next half-century, a blunt 6-word justification for cutting off a bloodline the court had decided was undesirable. That ruling was never formally overturned. It simply faded from use as attitudes shifted decades later, leaving behind it a legal architecture that had already shaped how an entire generation of doctors, judges, and social workers thought about disability. By the time our yellow-painted nursery reaches its quiet crisis in 1953, that architecture had produced, in state after state, a network of large residential institutions built specifically to house children and adults classified this way. They were called schools, colonies, homes, villages, softened pastoral names, chosen deliberately by the boards that built them in an era when the word institution itself was already beginning to feel unkind. Here is a fact that surprises most people hearing this story for the first time. Many of these institutions had been founded in the 1800s with genuinely progressive intentions, built by reformers who believed intellectually disabled children deserved specialized education rather than the almshouses and jails where they had often ended up before. The original architectural plans for places like these frequently called for small cottages, garden work, individualized teaching, a genuine campus in the pastoral sense of the word. What happened between that founding vision and the crowded wards of the 1950s was, in large part, simple arithmetic. State legislatures built these institutions once and then rarely funded them adequately again, even as intake numbers climbed year after year, fed by exactly the kind of hospital room recommendation we watched happen in the last chapter, repeated in delivery rooms across the country, month after month, for decades. By the early 1950s, several of the largest state institutions in the country were operating at more than double their intended capacity. A building designed with dormitory space for 600 residents might, by 1955, be housing well over 1,000. This was not a secret hidden from state officials. It appeared plainly in institutional budget requests and grand jury reports throughout the decade, largely unread by a public that had little reason to think about these buildings at all. Staffing followed the same arithmetic in reverse. Recommended ratios of caretakers to residents, modest to begin with, were routinely ignored for lack of funding, lack of applicants willing to do difficult work for low wages, and frankly, lack of public pressure to fix it. A single overnight attendant might be responsible in some wards for 60 or more residents at once, many of them non-verbal, many of them requiring physical assistance with the most basic tasks of daily living. It is worth saying plainly because the era's own language made it easy not to. These were, functionally, institutions of last resort operating at the scale and understaffing of triage centers, doing so continuously for years while being marketed to anxious young parents in hospital pamphlets as clean, staffed, and caring places built specifically for their child. The intake process itself, once a family had made the decision, was almost administrative in its plainness, a form, a physical examination, a photograph taken for the institutional file, not for the family, but for the institution's own records filed alongside a case number that would become, for many residents, the primary way staff referred to them for the rest of their stay. Something else happened quietly during intake that mattered enormously later. Many institutions, as a matter of standard procedure, changed how a child's given name was recorded, shortening it, simplifying it, sometimes replacing it altogether with a ward nickname assigned by staff for their own convenience. A child named Eleanor might become, within her first week, simply Elle or Ellie, or, in the flattest and most common case, nothing more personal than the surname on her chart. There was, in the middle of the 1950s, a small but growing countercurrent to all of this, though it had not yet reached most of the parents in doctors' offices across the country. In 1950, a group of parents of children with intellectual disabilities had begun meeting, quietly at first, in living rooms and church basements, comparing notes, sharing frustration, and slowly building what would become one of the most significant parent-led advocacy organizations in American history. Their early meetings were modest, their eventual influence was not. But in 1953, in the yellow-painted nursery we are following tonight, none of that had reached this particular young couple yet. What had reached them instead was a pamphlet with a soft pastoral name, a doctor's calm and practiced voice, and a legal and medical culture, decades in the making, that had already decided, long before this specific baby was born, exactly what the responsible next step should be. It is worth adding one further layer to this legal picture because it shapes how deeply this practice had settled into ordinary institutional life by the 1950s. More than 30 states at various points across the first half of the century passed their own sterilization statutes modeled on similar reasoning to the Supreme Court ruling we just discussed, applied to residents of state institutions with little in the way of individual consent or meaningful legal recourse. These laws remained on the books, actively enforced in a number of states, well into the very decade our story is set in, a detail that rarely appears in the softer, more nostalgic popular memory of the 1950s. Funding patterns for these institutions followed the same uneven, generally neglectful pattern nationwide, though the specifics varied by state and by decade. A wealthier, more urban state might allocate meaningfully more per resident than a poorer, more rural one, producing institutions of genuinely different quality even within the same broad system. This unevenness meant that where a family happened to live, more than almost any other single factor, often determined the actual daily conditions their child would experience. A geographic lottery that most parents signing intake papers in 1953 had no real way of researching or comparing in advance. It is worth adding, too, that professional medical opinion on this question was never quite as unanimous as the confident tone of any single doctor's office consultation might have suggested. A smaller number of physicians, pediatric specialists in particular, published dissenting views throughout the 1950s, arguing that families deserved more individualized guidance than a blanket institutional recommendation, and that children with these conditions could, in many cases, thrive with appropriate support at home. These dissenting voices existed within the same medical journals and professional conferences as the dominant view, but carried for most of the decade considerably less institutional weight and considerably less influence over what an average family doctor in an average town actually told an average frightened young couple in his office. Insurance and financial structures of the era added their own quiet pressure toward institutionalization as well, worth mentioning briefly here. Health insurance, where a family had it at all in the 1950s, rarely covered any meaningful ongoing support for a child with a significant disability living at home, while state institutional placement, by contrast, was typically funded almost entirely through public appropriation, at little to no direct cost to the family itself. For a young couple already anxious about their finances, this asymmetry, free institutional placement against largely unsupported and potentially very expensive home care, was rarely the deciding factor on its own, but it was, in a number of documented family accounts, a real and acknowledged part of the calculation. One further point of context belongs here before we move forward. The professional culture surrounding childbirth itself in this era, largely hospital-based, largely doctor-directed, with mothers given comparatively little agency over decisions made in the delivery room and its immediate aftermath, made this particular kind of rapid, doctor-led institutional recommendation considerably easier to carry out than it might have been under a different model of maternity care. A mother who had already been told, throughout her pregnancy and delivery, that the doctor knew best, arrived at this specific and devastating decision already primed, by months of accumulated deference, to trust that same voice one final time. It is easy, hearing all of this from the comfortable distance of decades, to feel a flash of anger at the doctor, at the legislature, at the whole machinery of the era. Let that anger arrive if it wants to, but let it settle too into something quieter, an understanding that this family was not choosing cruelty from a menu of kind alternatives. They were choosing, as best they understood it, between two paths that had both been built, brick by an entire century of people who came before them, most of whom believed sincerely and mistakenly that they were building something merciful. In the next chapter, we will follow that family on the day the choice becomes final. The long drive out past the edge of town to a building with a gentle name and a very different reality waiting behind its front doors. Let your breathing slow here for a moment first. There is no need to rush toward what comes next. The drive out to the institution usually took longer than anyone expected because these places were built deliberately at a distance. Zoning boards and town councils across the country had learned by the 1950s that residents did not particularly want a large state institution near their property lines, and so these campuses tended to sit well outside city limits, past the last gas station, down a county road that eventually narrowed and lost its centre line entirely. You are in the back seat of a sedan that still smells faintly of new upholstery, though the car is 3 years old now. Your mother sits up front, a small paper bag on her lap containing everything the intake letter told her to bring. 2 changes of clothing, a hairbrush, nothing more, because personal belongings, the letter explained, tended to get lost or damaged on the wards, and it was better not to send anything a family would mourn. The landscape outside the window changes slowly from town to farmland, fence posts ticking past in a rhythm that, on another day, might have been soothing. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark, the trees on either side of the road begin to thin, and then, quite suddenly, a wrought iron gate appears, flanked by stone pillars, with a name carved into the stone in the confident serif lettering favoured by institutions that wanted to project permanence and respectability in equal measure. The architecture itself deserves a moment of attention because it tells its own quiet story. Many of these campuses had been built decades earlier in a grand institutional style, long symmetrical wings extending from a central administrative building, tall windows, columned entrances, expansive lawns kept trimmed by resident labour. From the front gate on a sunny afternoon, a place like this could look, to an anxious parent driving in for the first time, almost like a small private college. That resemblance was not accidental. It was, in the language of the boards who commissioned these buildings a century earlier, meant to reassure. The reassurance tended to hold for exactly as long as the visit stayed near the administrative building, a receiving room with dark wood panelling and a portrait of the institution's founder, a superintendent's office, tidy, with framed diplomas and a view of the front lawn. A folder of paperwork slid across a wide desk, initialed and signed in the places marked with a small penciled X. There is a particular kind of paperwork worth noting here, because it will matter later in this story. Many intake forms of the era included a line for what the institution called a discouraged visitation recommendation, a formal, if gently worded suggestion that frequent family visits could disrupt a child's adjustment to institutional life, and that families were often better served and children better settled by limiting contact in the early months. Some superintendents recommended this as standard practice. Some families, exhausted and grieving and eager for guidance from anyone who seemed to know what they were doing, followed that recommendation for years rather than months. The paperwork completed, a staff member, often a nursing aide rather than the superintendent himself, would appear to take the child through a door that led out of the administrative wing entirely, into a connecting corridor that most visiting families never walked down themselves. This was the last moment for many parents of holding their child before what would sometimes stretch into years between visits, and sometimes, quietly, into decades. It is worth naming plainly what these institutions actually housed at scale behind that reassuring front facade, because the scale itself is one of the least known facts of this whole history. By the mid-1950s, several of the largest state institutions in the country held populations well over 3,000 residents on a single campus, a population larger than many of the small towns their gates opened onto. These were not small, discrete residences. They were among the largest total institutions of any kind operating in the United States at that time, larger than most prisons, larger than most hospitals, and almost entirely invisible to the general public that drove past their gates without a second glance. The corridors past the administrative wing told a very different architectural story than the front lawn had. Long, tiled, echoing hallways connected ward after ward, each one a large, open dormitory room lined with iron frame beds, sometimes 40 or 50 to a single room, with little in the way of partition or privacy. The tile itself, chosen originally for ease of cleaning, gave every sound, footsteps, a dropped tray, a child's cry, a hard, ringing quality that staff who worked there for years described later as something you either learned to stop hearing or never got used to at all. Ward assignment, in most institutions, was made by a combination of age, sex, and what the intake staff called functioning level. A rough, often inaccurate judgment made in a single afternoon's observation that would determine which ward, which staff, which daily routine a child would live inside for years to come. A misjudged placement, a child assigned to a ward meant for far more severe conditions than their own, was common enough that later investigations would cite it repeatedly as one of the system's quiet, ordinary failures. There is a detail from institutional photographs of the era, the ones taken for official state reports rather than family albums, that is easy to miss and worth noting here. In almost every one of these photographs, taken to demonstrate a ward's cleanliness or a dining hall's orderliness, the children and adults in the background are arranged, standing or seated, facing the camera with the same practiced stillness. Not the natural stillness of people posing happily for a picture, but the trained stillness of people who have learned, through repetition, exactly what is expected of them when a camera appears. Meals at most institutions were served in enormous communal dining halls on a fixed schedule that left little room for individual pace or preference. Staff shortages meant that residents who needed help eating often received it hurriedly, spoon after spoon in quick succession, less out of unkindness than out of the simple mathematics of 1 aide and 40 residents and a 30-minute meal window. Former staff members, interviewed decades later in oral history projects, described this specific memory, the speed of mealtimes, more often than almost any other single detail of daily institutional life. Clothing, too, tended to be institutional rather than personal. Many wards issued uniform garments, laundered in bulk and distributed without particular attention to individual fit or preference, a practical response to overcrowding that had the secondary effect, whether intended or not, of erasing one more small visible marker of who a child had been before they arrived. None of this is offered tonight to frighten you or to suggest that every institution or every day inside every institution was uniformly bleak. There were within these walls individual staff members who formed real and lasting bonds of care with the children in their wards, teachers who fought for better classroom materials, superintendents who genuinely tried, within impossible budgets, to improve conditions year over year. Kindness survived here, in pockets, the way kindness survives almost anywhere people are gathered, even under difficult systems. But the system itself, at the scale it operated in the 1950s, was built on an arithmetic that could not be solved by individual kindness alone. Too many residents, too few staff, too little funding, appropriated once at construction and rarely revisited with any urgency afterward, and behind the front gate, past the reassuring lawn and the columned entrance, an entire hidden population of American children, thousands of them, quietly living lives that the families driving away that afternoon would spend years, in some cases, trying very hard not to think about. There is a smaller, easily overlooked detail about the intake photograph mentioned earlier that is worth returning to because it connects directly to tonight's larger theme. That single institutional photograph, taken for the case file rather than the family, often became, over the following years, the only photograph that continued to be taken of that child at all. While the family at home moved through birthdays and holidays and school portraits, updating their own album year after year with images of the children who remained, the institutionalized child's visual record frequently froze at that single intake photograph, updated rarely if ever, so that a parent visiting 5 or 10 years later might be startled by how much the actual child in front of them had changed since the last image they had been shown. Some institutions did maintain more regular photography, usually for administrative rather than sentimental purposes, documentation for state reports, occasional images used in institutional newsletters distributed to donors and local charitable organizations. Families were rarely offered copies of these photographs directly, and a number of the images that do survive in state archives were, for decades, simply filed away, unseen by anyone outside the institution's own administrative staff, including the families of the children pictured in them. It is worth noting one further architectural detail, easy to miss but telling in retrospect. Many of these institutions positioned their superintendent's office and the small handful of rooms visiting families actually saw, the receiving room, the visiting room, occasionally a model classroom kept especially tidy for tours, along the single front-facing wing nearest the gate, while the vast majority of the campus, the actual wards where residents lived out their days, extended back and away from that public-facing wing, often separated by additional locked doors and long connecting corridors. A visiting family, even one who came regularly over years, might in practice see only a small, carefully maintained fraction of the institution their child actually lived inside. For a small number of families, this first visit was also quietly and without either parent quite admitting it aloud to the other, the last time they would see their child for a very long while. Not because any rule required it, and not because love had suddenly run out, but because the specific, practiced calm the doctor and the intake staff had modeled throughout the entire process carried within it an unspoken suggestion that the kindest thing now was distance, that checking in too often might unsettle a fragile new adjustment, that the responsible parent trusted the institution to do its work without needing to watch it happen. Some parents absorbed that suggestion more completely than others. The drive home for the parents in our story was quieter than the drive out had been. There is very little conversation recorded in the oral histories gathered later about what was said in the car on the way back to town. Mostly, people remember the radio. Someone usually turned the radio on not long after pulling back through the gate and let it fill the space where a conversation might otherwise have had to go. A map of distant places. The institution in our story is, for the purposes of tonight's telling, a composite, built from patterns documented across many real places rather than tied to any single one. But it is worth pausing here to sketch, briefly and gently, the actual geography of this history, because these were not hidden or secret buildings. They were large, well-known, publicly funded institutions, many of which still stand today, repurposed or partially demolished, their names still recognizable to anyone who grew up nearby. In eastern Pennsylvania, a large state institution operated for most of the 20th century on a sprawling campus of Victorian-era buildings, at its peak housing well over 2,000 residents in a facility originally designed for a fraction of that number. Investigations conducted there in later decades documented severe overcrowding and understaffing consistent with the broader national pattern we have discussed tonight. And the institution's eventual closure, decades later, followed extensive legal action brought on behalf of its residents. On Staten Island in New York, another large state institution opened in the 1940s specifically to house children and young adults with intellectual disabilities, grew rapidly through the 1950s and 1960s into one of the largest facilities of its kind in the country. This is the institution whose conditions, exposed on television in 1972, became the specific catalyst for the broader legal reforms we discussed in an earlier chapter. A single, well-documented place whose story became, for a national television audience, representative of a much larger and largely unseen national pattern. Further north, in New York's Hudson Valley, a state institution originally established in the late 1800s under a considerably more optimistic founding vision operated for nearly a century, its population likewise expanding far beyond its original architectural intent by the middle of the 20th century. Its campus, like a number of others across the country, included its own on-site cemetery, one of the burial grounds later researchers and volunteers would work, decades afterward, to identify and restore names to. On the West Coast, a large state facility north of San Francisco housed a similarly sized population through the middle decades of the century, serving families across a wide swath of Northern California who had, in many documented cases, no meaningfully closer alternative available to them at all. Its distance from most of the families it served was, as we discussed earlier in tonight's story, itself a significant barrier to the kind of regular visitation that might otherwise have kept some family bonds more actively maintained. It is worth noting that nearly every state in the country operated at least one institution of this general type by the middle of the 20th century, a genuinely nationwide system rather than a regional anomaly. Names varied by state, state schools, state colonies, training schools, state hospitals for the feeble-minded, in the era's own blunt clinical language, but the underlying pattern of overcrowding, underfunding, and eventual public reckoning repeated itself with only modest variation from coast to coast. Several of these campuses, it is worth mentioning, occupied genuinely striking architecture, designed by notable institutional architects of their founding eras, with grand administrative buildings, elaborate ironwork, and carefully landscaped grounds that reflected the genuinely reformist ambitions of the boards who first commissioned them in the 1800s. A number of these buildings, now closed or repurposed for other uses, have since been recognized on historic preservation registries, an irony not lost on the disability historians who have spent recent decades documenting what actually happened inside them during the very era their architecture was designed to project confidence and care. The regional variation in this history is worth a moment of honest attention as well. Southern states, operating under a combination of more limited public health funding and, in a number of documented cases, explicitly segregated institutional systems that separated residents by race in ways that created entirely separate and often even more severely underfunded facilities for black children and families, produced their own distinct and, in several respects, even harsher version of this same national pattern. Disability historians studying this regional dimension have noted that any full accounting of this era's institutional history must reckon honestly with how racial segregation compounded the basic failures we have discussed tonight for families who were already contending with the additional weight of a deeply unequal broader society. It is against this genuinely nationwide backdrop, institutions in nearly every state, similar architecture, similar founding optimism, similar decades of underfunding, similar eventual public reckoning, that the single family we have been following tonight should be understood, not as an unusual or isolated case, but as one small, specific instance of a pattern repeated, with only modest local variation in thousands of towns across the entire country for the better part of a century. A number of these campuses also maintained their own on-site farms and gardens, worked substantially by resident labor as we discussed earlier, that in several documented cases supplied a meaningful portion of the institution's own food needs. This arrangement, while economically useful to a chronically underfunded system, also meant that a resident's daily labor was, in a very direct sense, subsidizing the very institution responsible for their care, a detail later investigations and advocacy reports would point to repeatedly as an uncomfortable blurring of therapeutic work and simple unpaid labor performed under conditions residents had little power to negotiate. In the Midwest, several states operated similarly large training schools throughout this era, many of them located, like so many others in this history, on rural land some distance from the state's major population centers, a siting decision that reflected both the practical availability of cheap land and the broader cultural preference, already discussed, for keeping these facilities at a comfortable social distance from everyday town life. Families in these states described drives to visit that could stretch to several hours each way, a detail that, as we noted earlier, quietly shaped how often even the most devoted parents could realistically manage a visit across an entire year. We return now to the ward itself, to the particular daily texture of institutional life that these grand, distant buildings actually contained behind their striking, reassuring front facades. There is a particular quality to institutional time that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not lived inside it, and easier to understand through sound than through anything else. A ward in a state institution in the 1950s ran on bells, whistles, and the footsteps of staff moving down tiled corridors at set hours, a rhythm imposed from outside rather than grown from within, the way a season or a habit grows. Morning arrived early, usually before 6, with an overhead light switched on all at once rather than dawning gradually the way morning does at home. Residents who could dress themselves did so quickly, under mild time pressure, while those who needed help waited their turn in a line that moved as fast as a single overworked aide could manage. Breakfast, as we touched on already, moved with a similar briskness. Oatmeal or cream of wheat, served from large institutional pots, eaten at long tables under fluorescent light that many former residents, interviewed decades later, remembered as a specific and lasting sensory memory of those years, a particular flat white quality of light that they could still describe vividly in old age. Here is a fact that surprises people who assume institutions of this era offered no education at all. Many did operate on-site schools, at least on paper, with classrooms and blackboards, and, in the better-funded institutions, genuinely dedicated teachers working with children whose intellectual capacities were often significantly underestimated by the very system housing them. The quality of this education varied enormously from institution to institution, and even from ward to ward within the same campus, depending almost entirely on how a given superintendent chose to allocate an always inadequate budget. For residents assessed, often inaccurately, as having more limited capacity, the daily schedule tended to shift away from classroom instruction and toward what institutions of the era called occupational therapy or work training, folding laundry for the institution's own use, assisting in the kitchen, working in the on-site garden or farm that many of these campuses maintained. It is worth noting plainly that this resident labour, largely unpaid, was often essential to the institution's own basic operation, a detail that later investigations and lawsuits would point to repeatedly as a troubling blurring of therapy and simple unpaid work. Afternoons, when weather permitted, often included time outdoors on the grounds, and it is worth remembering here that many of these campuses, whatever their failures indoors, genuinely did occupy beautiful old grounds, planted decades earlier with mature trees, walking paths, sometimes even small ponds. Former residents' recollections of institutional life are not uniformly grim on this point. Several oral history collections include specific fond memories of a particular tree, a particular bench, a particular hour of afternoon sun that offered something like peace inside an otherwise difficult system. Holidays were marked, in most institutions, with a genuine effort at festivity. A Christmas tree in the main dining hall, donated toys distributed by local charitable organizations, sometimes a visit from community volunteers who came specifically to spend an afternoon with residents who had few or no family visitors of their own. These efforts were real and appreciated by residents at the time, even as they existed within a system that had, in most other respects, quietly cut these same children off from the families who might otherwise have provided that companionship year-round. It is a strange and specific kind of sorrow, documented again and again in later interviews with adults who grew up in these institutions. The memory of genuinely kind individual staff members, remembered by name and by small, specific gestures of warmth decades later, existing alongside a broader system that these same adults describe, in the same interviews, as having failed them in enormous and lasting ways. Both things were true at once. An aide might have snuck an extra dessert to a favourite resident on a Tuesday, and that same ward might have been operating on that same Tuesday at nearly double its intended capacity with a fraction of its needed staff. Medical care within these institutions followed a similarly uneven pattern. Some campuses maintained genuinely capable on-site infirmaries, staffed by dedicated nurses who caught and treated illnesses early. Others, particularly the larger and more overcrowded institutions, struggled to provide even basic preventive care, a gap that later state investigations, conducted in the 1960s and 1970s, would cite as a contributing factor in mortality rates that were, at several major institutions, significantly higher among residents than among the general population of the same age. Communication with the outside world, for residents whose families maintained contact, generally took the form of letters, monitored to varying degrees by institutional staff, and occasional supervised visits, often held not in a resident's own living space but in a designated visiting room near the administrative building, the same room, in many cases, where the family had first signed the intake papers years earlier. For residents whose families did not maintain contact, and this, as we will see in the coming chapters, was a substantial and growing number as the years passed, the ward itself became, in a very real sense, the whole of a child's known family. Staff members, other residents, the particular rhythm of a particular ward became the entirety of a person's daily emotional world for years, sometimes for the length of an entire childhood and beyond. There is a specific and quietly devastating detail that appears again and again in later interviews with former residents who had been placed as very young children and grew up almost entirely within the institution. Many of them describe a slow, gradual forgetting, not of the institution, which became intimately, thoroughly known to them, but of the outside world itself, of the specific idea of a family, a home, a name that was theirs alone rather than a ward nickname assigned by staff. Several described decades later the particular disorientation of being told, as adults, that they had once had parents, siblings, a house with a yellow room, none of which they could actually remember at all. It would be simple and false to describe every day inside every institution as uniform suffering, just as it would be false to describe this system as anything other than a serious and sustained failure of collective care. The truth sits, uncomfortably, somewhere between those two descriptions. A system that housed genuine kindness and genuine harm within the same buildings, often within the same hour, delivered by the same tired, underpaid, frequently well-meaning staff working under conditions that made real, individualized care almost structurally impossible to sustain. Weekends inside these institutions carried their own particular rhythm, distinct from the weekday schedule of classes and work assignments. Saturday mornings were often given over to more thorough bathing and grooming routines, staff moving briskly down a ward, readying residents for the small chance of a weekend visitor, a chance that, for a meaningful number of residents, arrived less and less often as the years passed, until it stopped arriving altogether. Sunday, in institutions with a religious affiliation or a visiting chaplain, often included some form of communal worship, one of the few regular occasions in institutional life where residents from different wards might be gathered together in the same room at the same time. Recreational life, where it existed at all, tended to depend heavily on the particular interests and energy of individual staff members rather than any consistent institutional program. A ward with an aide who enjoyed music might have regular informal singing in the evenings, an activity several former residents recall fondly decades later. A ward without such a staff member might have considerably less structured recreation of any kind, the evening hours simply filled with quiet, unstructured time between supper and the lights-out bell. Seasonal changes brought their own particular texture to ward life, worth mentioning here because they offered one of the few genuinely uncontrolled variables in an otherwise tightly scheduled existence. Summer meant longer outdoor time on those same mature, decades-old grounds we described earlier, sometimes supervised swimming in an on-site pond where one existed, a genuine highlight several former residents recall fondly even now. Winter meant more time confined to the ward itself, the tiled corridors and communal day rooms taking on an even greater weight in a resident's daily experience when the outdoor grounds were no longer a realistic escape from them. It is worth adding, finally, a small but meaningful detail about how residents themselves sometimes shaped ward culture in ways the official schedule never accounted for. Older residents on many wards took on informal caretaking roles toward younger or more vulnerable residents entirely on their own initiative, without any staff instruction or institutional recognition. A kind of quiet, self-organized mutual care that several former residents interviewed decades later credit directly with making an otherwise difficult daily existence genuinely bearable, and in some cases, genuinely warm. We will return, later in this story, to what eventually forced this system into the light and what changed because of it. But for now, let us step back out through that wrought iron gate, back down the long county road, and return to the family we left in the last chapter, or to the quiet drive home and to the specific, deliberate work that began almost immediately in the weeks that followed. The work of removing a child gently and completely from every photograph still to be taken. It would be a mistake to imagine this story as belonging only to families whose children were born with the specific chromosomal difference we described in the opening chapters. The institutions we have been walking through tonight, and the quiet family editing that followed, touched a far wider range of children than that single diagnosis alone. Cerebral palsy, epilepsy, congenital deafness combined with other conditions, developmental delays with no clear diagnostic name at all, children with any of these, and many other conditions besides, could find themselves recommended for the very same institutional pathway, sorted by the same broad and often imprecise clinical vocabulary of the era. The umbrella term used most often in official documents of the 1950s was simply feeble-minded, a single word doing the work that dozens of more precise diagnostic categories would eventually replace decades later as medical understanding slowly caught up with the sheer variety of conditions it had been carelessly grouping together. This imprecision had real consequences. Children with conditions that caused no intellectual impairment whatsoever, profound deafness, for instance, or a severe stutter, or cerebral palsy affecting only physical coordination while leaving intelligence entirely intact, were, in a documented number of cases, misclassified and institutionalized alongside children with significant cognitive disabilities on the basis of a single brief evaluation that had no reliable way of distinguishing between a communication barrier and an intellectual one. It is worth mentioning, too, a case from this era that became, decades later, a matter of significant public record because it illustrates how far this pattern reached, even into families with every possible resource and advantage. In the early 1940s, a young woman from one of the most prominent political families in the country underwent an experimental medical procedure intended to address mood instability, a procedure that left her with permanent and severe cognitive impairment. What followed was a story that will sound, by now, quietly familiar. she was moved to an institution, her whereabouts kept from public knowledge for years, her name removed from the family's public appearances and, in a great many photographs, from its visual record as well. Her own family did not publicly acknowledge the full truth of what had happened to her for decades. If it could happen to a family with wealth, connections, and every resource available to them, it is worth sitting with how much more easily it happened quietly and without any public record at all to families with none of those advantages. The economic dimension of this story deserves its own honest mention. Wealthier families, in a documented number of cases, were able to place children in smaller, better-funded private institutions, sometimes even hiring dedicated private caretakers rather than relying on a state system at all, arrangements that could look, from a distance, considerably gentler than what we walked through in earlier chapters, while still involving the same fundamental decision to remove a child from the family's visible daily life. Families without those resources had in practice only the overcrowded state system available to them, the same system whose scale and understaffing we examined earlier tonight. Rural families faced their own particular version of this problem, one shaped less by wealth than by simple distance. A family living several hours from the nearest state institution faced a genuinely difficult calculation that urban and suburban families rarely had to make in quite the same way. A visit that might require an entire day's travel each direction, a hardship that, over years, quietly discouraged even families who had every intention of maintaining close contact from actually managing to do so with any real frequency. There is a specific historical irony worth noting here because it complicates any simple story about which families made which choices. Some of the very same rural communities that had, culturally, the strongest tradition of keeping disabled family members at home, a tradition rooted less in progressive disability politics than in simple rural practicality, where every set of hands on a farm had value regardless of how that person learned or moved, nonetheless sent a significant number of children to institutions during this era too, often on the advice of the same travelling county doctor who had delivered half the babies in the region and whose medical training reflected the same era-wide assumptions we have discussed throughout tonight's story. It is worth returning briefly to the sheer diversity hidden inside the era's flattening vocabulary. Institutional intake records from this period, where they survive and have been studied by later researchers, reveal populations that included children with what we would now recognize as autism, children with undiagnosed hearing loss, children who had experienced birth trauma resulting in a wide range of different physical and cognitive effects, and children whose only documented difficulty, on close later review of their surviving records, appears to have been a difficult early childhood combined with an overworked, under-resourced evaluator with very little time and a very blunt set of diagnostic tools. None of this is offered to suggest that every child placed in an institution during this era was, in fact, entirely typically developing and simply misclassified. Many children genuinely required significant, specialized daily support that families and communities of the era, lacking any real infrastructure for community-based care, were not equipped to provide on their own. The tragedy of this history is not that disability itself was treated as a serious matter requiring real support. It is that the specific narrow solution offered, distant institutionalization followed by careful family concealment, was applied so broadly to such a wide range of genuinely different circumstances by a medical and legal system that had not yet developed the tools or the will to tell those circumstances apart. It is worth mentioning briefly how differently this same era treated conditions we would now consider entirely unrelated to intellectual disability, but that the loose vocabulary of the time sometimes swept into the same broad category. A child born with a significant physical difference but entirely typical cognitive development might, in a documented number of cases, still be recommended for institutional placement. Less because any doctor genuinely believed the two things were the same, and more because the culture of the era had few other socially acceptable pathways available for a family raising a visibly different child, and the institution, however imperfect, was at least an established, familiar option. This same pattern reached into deaf and hard-of-hearing communities in a particularly well-documented way. a child with typical intelligence but significant hearing loss, born into a family with no prior experience of deafness and no access to sign language instruction, could be misjudged as intellectually delayed simply because the standard evaluation tools of the era relied so heavily on verbal response, with little accommodation for a child who could not hear the questions being asked in the first place. Deaf community historians have documented a number of such cases. Individuals who spent years in institutions intended for intellectual disability, whose actual and only difference had been an unaddressed hearing loss from birth. It is worth noting, finally, how this broad and imprecise era of classification eventually gave way to something more careful. Over the following decades, medical and psychological understanding of intellectual and developmental disability grew considerably more precise, distinguishing between dozens of specific conditions that the 1950s had often lumped together under a single blunt clinical umbrella. This growing precision, arriving gradually across the second half of the century, would go on to shape the more individualized, more humane approach to care and education that later reforms, discussed in the chapters ahead, eventually made possible. It is worth remembering, as we close this particular chapter, that the sheer breadth of who ended up inside these institutions is precisely what made the later reform and reunion work described in the chapters ahead so genuinely complicated. Researchers helping a family search institutional records in recent decades often cannot know, in advance, whether the relative they are searching for had a significant, lifelong intellectual disability, a misdiagnosed physical or sensory condition, or something closer to an ordinary childhood complicated only by an era with very little patience for difference of any kind. Each of these possibilities carries its own particular weight for the family doing the searching, and researchers describe approaching every new case with real care, precisely because the range of what they might find is genuinely so wide. It is worth remembering that all of this, the misdiagnoses, the imprecise vocabulary, the sheer breadth of children swept into a single overburdened system, happened not out of any single institution's individual malice, but out of an entire era's collective failure to build anything more careful, more individualized, or more patient than the blunt tools it actually had. That failure was widespread, largely invisible to the public at the time, and, as we will see, ultimately correctable, once enough people were finally willing to look at it directly. We return now to the ward we left in the previous chapter, and to the particular quiet, patient interior life of the children who lived inside it. Children who, whatever brought them there, spent years of ordinary daily existence largely unseen by the outside world, waiting, in whatever way each of them understood waiting, for a visit, a letter, a name spoken aloud that did not always come. Return with me now to the small house with the yellow room, some months after that first quiet drive out past the edge of town. The crib has been taken down and given to the cousin who was expecting her own baby. The mobile of felt ducklings has gone with it. And on the mantelpiece, in a frame that used to hold a photograph taken at the hospital in the first hours after the birth, there is now a different photograph entirely, one taken a few weeks later, of the older children alone, arranged by height, smiling the practiced smile of the era. This is the part of the story that gives tonight's topic its shape, and it deserves to be told slowly, because the mechanics of it are almost more unsettling than the decision that preceded it. A family did not simply stop mentioning a child who had been placed in an institution. In many documented cases, across many decades of gathered oral history, families performed a deliberate, ongoing physical editing of their own visual record, removing that child not just from conversation, but from the photographs themselves. Sometimes this took the gentle form of simple omission. A family portrait taken at a photography studio downtown, the appointment scheduled deliberately for a season when only the remaining children would be photographed, so that no explanation would ever be required for a gap in a group shot. This was in many ways the kindest version of the practice, requiring no active destruction, only careful planning of what would and would not be documented going forward. But the oral history record also holds a great many accounts of something more direct. A mother, alone in the evening after the other children were asleep, going through the family album page by page with a pair of small sewing scissors, trimming a particular child out of group photographs one at a time. What remained in many of these albums are photographs with an oddly cropped edge, a hand resting on a shoulder that no longer has a body attached to it, a small shoe visible at the very bottom corner of an otherwise complete family portrait, evidence of a person the scissors did not quite manage to remove entirely. One quick reminder here, since we're at the middle of tonight's story, if you'd rather close your eyes completely and just listen, this video and every other story in our library is up as an audiobook on Spotify too, links in the description or the pinned comment. Historians and family researchers who have studied these edited albums closely have noted a recurring, quietly heartbreaking pattern in how the cropping itself was done. It was almost never careless. The remaining photograph is usually trimmed with real care, the composition subtly rebalanced so that what remains looks to an outside eye like a complete and intentional picture rather than a mutilated one. This was not an act of anger. It was an act of concealment performed with the same domestic diligence a mother might bring to hemming a dress or icing a cake, competent, careful, and almost unbearably sad in retrospect. Letters to extended family followed a similar pattern of careful management. Relatives who lived at a distance and who had perhaps met the child only once or twice as an infant were often simply never told what had happened at all. Christmas card lists were quietly updated. An aunt in another state, writing to ask after the new baby a year or two later, might receive a reply that mentioned the older children by name and simply left the question unanswered. A small evasion easy enough to make once and then, through repetition, easy enough to maintain indefinitely. For relatives who did need some explanation, a grandparent living nearby, for instance, who could not plausibly remain unaware that a grandchild had been born and then somehow ceased to be mentioned, families developed a small, tragic vocabulary of soft euphemism that appears again and again across independently gathered accounts from this era. The baby did not thrive. The baby was sickly and did not survive infancy. The family does not discuss it, and it is kinder not to ask. These phrases, remarkably consistent from household to household, suggest less a coordinated strategy than a shared cultural script that an entire generation of American families independently reached for in the same moment of need. Perhaps the most difficult piece of this practice to sit with is what happened for children born into the family afterward. Younger siblings who arrived in the years following an older brother or sister's institutionalization, and who were, in a great many documented cases, never told that an older sibling existed at all. These younger children grew up believing themselves an only child, or the youngest of three when they were in fact the youngest of four, their entire understanding of their own family's shape built on a foundation their parents had quietly and deliberately incomplete. It is worth pausing on how this silence was maintained inside a household day to day for years. Family members who did know, an older sibling perhaps, who remembered the missing brother or sister before the institutionalization, or a grandparent who had been present at the birth, developed their own private discipline of not mentioning it, not out of active cruelty toward the younger children being kept in the dark, but often out of a genuine, if misguided, belief that this was a mercy. Why burden a child, the thinking went, with a sorrow they had no memory of and could do nothing to change? Photographs from institutional visits, on the rare occasions families did take a camera along, add one more quiet layer to this record. Several of the surviving images gathered by researchers show a family posed together on institutional grounds, parents, visiting siblings, and the resident child together for an afternoon, that were, notably, never placed in the family's home photo album at all. They exist instead in a separate, unlabeled envelope tucked into the back of a drawer, a physical record kept apart from the rest of the family's visual history, as though the album itself had rules about what belonged inside it and what did not. There is a particular kind of grief embedded in this act of careful, deliberate editing that is worth naming plainly. A parent who cuts a child out of a photograph with a pair of small sewing scissors is not, in that moment, performing indifference. They are performing an act of extraordinary, ongoing labor to manage a sorrow they have been told, repeatedly and by figures of authority, that they must not indulge. The scissors are not evidence of not caring. In a strange and painful way, they are evidence of caring so much that the sight of the gap became unbearable to look at directly, and so the gap itself had to be edited into something smoother, something the eye could pass over without stopping. Some families maintained this silence for the rest of their lives, the secret dying, quite literally, with the parents who kept it. Others carried it less successfully, the weight of it surfacing in small, unexplained ways. An unexplained sadness on a particular date each year that no one in the younger generation understood the significance of, a locked drawer no child was ever permitted to open, a name that very occasionally a grieving mother might murmur in her sleep and never explain the next morning. There is a particular category of family record worth mentioning here as well. The family Bible, which in many households of this era served as the single most authoritative and permanent place to record births, marriages, and deaths. Even in families who edited every photograph and rewrote every casual conversation about the missing child, researchers have found that the birth was very often still recorded, quietly and without comment, in the Bible's family register pages, a small act of permanence that seems to have felt different to many of these parents from the more visible and revisable medium of a photograph album or a Christmas card list. Wedding albums and other later family milestones show a similar, quietly consistent pattern of omission. A sibling's wedding photograph from 1968, for instance, might show every other family member present and accounted for, with the institutionalized sibling invited, in some documented cases but unable to attend, or in other cases simply never told the event was happening at all, entirely absent from both the guest list and the visual record the family kept of the day. These later omissions, occurring decades after the original decision, suggest how thoroughly the initial editing tended to become simply the ongoing, unquestioned habit of an entire family's life. One further quiet detail is worth adding here, gathered from several family accounts independently. A number of mothers who performed this careful editing work also, in the same years, kept a separate and entirely private collection somewhere the rest of the family never saw. A single uncropped photograph, a lock of hair from infancy, a hospital bracelet tucked away not for display but simply for the mother's own occasional solitary looking. These small private archives, discovered later by adult children going through a deceased mother's belongings, suggest that the public editing and the private remembering were, for many of these women, two entirely separate and simultaneous acts, each one true in its own way. Local photography studios, in a small number of documented cases, kept their own business records, appointment books, order forms, that have occasionally allowed later researchers to notice exactly the kind of pattern we are describing tonight from the outside. A family's annual portrait order, for instance, quietly shrinking by one place setting between 1 year's sitting and the next, with no explanation offered or requested at the time, filed away in an ordinary studio ledger that no one, for decades, had any particular reason to examine closely enough to notice. We will spend some time in the chapters ahead with the children who grew up on the other side of this silence, the younger siblings who eventually, sometimes decades later, learned the truth, and with the small number of parents who refused, from the very beginning, to make this choice at all. But let this image rest with you a moment longer first. A mother at her kitchen table in the evening, the rest of the house asleep, a photograph album open in front of her and a small pair of scissors in her hand, doing the quiet, careful work of a decade that asked mothers to do exactly this and rarely asked whether they should have to. Imagine growing up inside a house that has one closed door in it, figuratively speaking, and never knowing the door is there at all. This was the particular inheritance of the younger siblings born after an older brother or sister had already been placed. Children who arrived into a family shape that had already been quietly, permanently altered before they ever took their first breath, and who spent their entire childhoods without knowing it. There is something worth understanding about how thoroughly a secret like this could be kept inside an otherwise ordinary, loving household. It did not usually require active, constant vigilance. It required instead a handful of small and consistent habits, repeated so many times over so many years that they stopped feeling like concealment at all and simply became the accepted shape of how this particular family talked, or did not talk, about certain things. A birthday, for instance, that quietly went unmentioned each year without any of the younger children ever registering its absence because they had no reason to know it belonged to anyone. A box of outgrown baby clothes in the attic that no one commented on because attics are full of boxes and children rarely ask about all of them. A grandmother who occasionally started a sentence with the words "your brother" and then, catching herself, finished it a different way entirely, so smoothly that a child listening had no reason to notice the correction at all. Family researchers who have studied this pattern closely describe it aptly as a kind of accidental fluency. Parents who had never planned to become skilled at concealment, who had simply, through years of repetition, become extremely good at it, the way anyone becomes good at a habit practiced daily without particular attention. By the time these younger children were old enough to ask questions of their own, the silence around the missing sibling had been so completely absorbed into the ordinary texture of family life that there was, quite literally, nothing visible left to ask about. There were, however, small cracks in this fluency, and the oral history record is full of them, gathered decades later from adults who remembered, as children, a specific and unexplained oddity that they had filed away without understanding, only to have it resurface with sudden clarity once the larger truth finally emerged. A locked bottom drawer in a parent's dresser, a particular date each spring when a mother grew quiet and distracted for no reason anyone could name, a framed photograph glimpsed once in a grandparent's house and never seen again, of a baby no one in the immediate family ever discussed. One detail appears with striking consistency across many independently collected family accounts from this era: the missing sibling's name itself. Many families, even those who told younger children nothing else at all, preserved that name somewhere, inscribed in a family Bible's birth records, carved faintly into the wood of a hope chest, written once on a hospital bracelet kept in a keepsake box. It is as though even the most careful, sustained concealment could not quite bring itself to erase the one thing that made the missing child a person rather than an absence. The name survived even when almost nothing else about them was permitted to. For the siblings who did know, the ones old enough at the time of the institutionalization to remember it clearly, childhood took on a different and more difficult shape entirely. They carried a private grief that the rest of the household had implicitly agreed not to discuss, which meant carrying it largely alone, without the ordinary channels of comfort a family usually offers a grieving child. Several of these siblings, interviewed decades later as adults, described a specific and lasting habit that stayed with them long into old age, an instinct to keep certain sorrows entirely private, learned early and never fully unlearned, because the model they had grown up inside had taught them, without ever saying so directly, that this was simply what a family did with pain of this particular kind. School presented its own small, quiet complications for these families. A teacher taking attendance from an official birth record might occasionally stumble across a name the family had never mentioned at home, or a classmate's parent, aware of the old neighborhood gossip from years before, might make an offhand reference that a younger child overheard and filed away without understanding. Families managed these moments the way they managed everything else about the secret, quietly, quickly, with a redirection so smooth that a child rarely thought to push further. It would be easy, from this distance, to judge these parents harshly for the silence they built and maintained for so many years. But it is worth remembering what we established earlier in this story, that this silence had been recommended to them, gently and repeatedly, by doctors and institutional staff who genuinely believed, within the medical understanding of their era, that minimizing a family's ongoing emotional entanglement with an institutionalized child was the healthiest path forward for everyone involved, including the younger children who would grow up never knowing what they had lost. There is a particular kind of loneliness in this story that belongs neither to the institutionalized child nor to the parents who made the original decision, but to these younger siblings specifically, people who spent decades living inside a family shape they did not know was incomplete, who grieved later, not only for the brother or sister they never had the chance to know, but for the years of their own childhood spent unknowingly standing on top of a foundation their parents had quietly hollowed out beneath them. Not every family managed to keep the secret complete. Some cracked under its own weight long before any deliberate revelation. A grandmother's slip of the tongue at a funeral, a distant cousin's careless comment at a family reunion, a birth certificate discovered by accident while searching for something else entirely in a filing cabinet. These accidental discoveries, several adults later recalled, were often more disorienting than a planned, gentle revelation would have been, precisely because they arrived without any preparation at all, dropped suddenly into an ordinary afternoon with no warning and no context. It is worth adding a specific recurring detail from these later accounts. Many of the younger siblings who eventually learned the truth describe a particular retrospective rereading of their own childhood. Small memories suddenly reinterpreted in light of the new information. A parent's unexplained tears during a particular television program years earlier about a family separated by illness. A refusal, gentle but firm and never explained, to ever visit a certain wing of the local hospital. A specific hymn that made a mother visibly emotional every single time it was sung at church, for reasons that, at the time, no child in the pew beside her had any way of understanding. Family therapists and researchers who study intergenerational secrecy more broadly have noted that this particular pattern, sustained, unexplained emotional responses to seemingly unrelated triggers, is one of the more common ways that a hidden family history quietly makes itself felt even inside a household where it is otherwise never directly discussed. The secret, in other words, rarely stayed entirely contained. It simply expressed itself sideways in forms that a child growing up inside that household had no framework yet to correctly interpret. It is worth noting, too, how differently individual siblings within the very same family sometimes reacted to eventually learning this history. One sibling, interviewed decades later, might describe the discovery primarily as a relief, finally explaining a lifetime of small, unexplained family oddities. Another sibling, raised in the very same household under the very same silence, might describe the same discovery primarily as a betrayal, a fundamental rupture in their trust of parents who had, in their view, kept something this significant hidden for an entire lifetime. Family researchers who study this pattern note that there is no single, predictable emotional outcome to this kind of discovery, only a wide and genuinely varied range of individual responses, shaped as much by each sibling's own personality and life circumstances as by the facts of the history itself. There is one more recurring detail from these later accounts worth including here. A number of adult children, once they learned the full history, describe going back through their own childhood photographs with an entirely new eye, looking specifically for the small, careful trimming we discussed a few chapters ago, and finding it, in several documented cases, in albums they had looked at hundreds of times before without ever once noticing anything unusual about a particular page's composition. Once you know to look for it, several of these adults note, it becomes strangely difficult not to see it, a detail that had been sitting in plain sight in a family album on a living room shelf for an entire lifetime. We will spend real time later in this story with what happened when these discoveries finally came, the shock of them, and, in many cases, the slow and moving process of reconnection that followed. But first, let us turn to a smaller, quieter thread in this history. The parents who, faced with the very same doctor's recommendation, the very same pamphlet with its soft pastoral name, said no. Their story does not appear as often in the record because it was, by the numbers, the far less common choice in this era. But it happened. And it is worth understanding what it cost the families who made it. We have spent most of tonight's story looking at this history from the outside, from the perspective of parents making an agonizing decision, of siblings growing up inside a carefully maintained silence, of a whole medical and legal system built around a single mistaken confidence. It is worth turning now, gently, toward the perspective we have touched least directly so far, the children themselves, living out their days on the other side of that wrought iron gate. This is, by necessity, the hardest part of the story to tell with confidence, because so many of the people who lived it left behind far fewer written records than the parents and doctors who made decisions about them. Institutional case files, where they survive, tend to record clinical observations rather than a resident's own inner experience. It is only in more recent decades, as former residents of these institutions have aged into adulthood and in a meaningful number of cases been interviewed directly by researchers and disability historians, that anything like a first-person record of this experience has begun to exist at all. What those interviews reveal, again and again, is something that should not, perhaps, surprise us, though it was rarely accounted for by the system that housed these children for so many years. A rich, ordinary inner life, continuing quietly underneath the institutional routine we walked through earlier tonight. Friendships formed with other residents that lasted, in some documented cases, for decades. Favorite staff members remembered with real warmth many years later. Small private rituals and preferences that had nothing at all to do with a diagnosis and everything to do with simply being a particular person, living a particular life, day after day, inside walls that had not been built with much interest in exactly that fact. Many former residents, interviewed as adults, described developing genuinely close bonds with fellow residents on their ward, relationships that functioned, in a great many respects, like the sibling relationships that institutional placement had often interrupted or prevented entirely. In the absence of the family that had been edited out of the story, some residents built something like a substitute family among the other children and adults who shared their ward, their meals, their years. There is a specific and recurring theme in these later interviews worth naming directly: hope, sustained often for years, sometimes for decades, that a visit or a letter would eventually come. Former residents describe watching as children for the specific cars that brought visiting families onto the grounds on visiting days, learning quickly which children had regular visitors and which did not, and holding quietly and privately their own hope that this particular Sunday might be different from the last one. For residents whose families did maintain some ongoing contact, even sparse contact, that connection carried enormous weight. A letter arriving once every few months, brief and often written by a parent who did not entirely know what to say, is described by several former residents as one of the most significant events of an entire institutional year, read many times over, kept carefully, sometimes memorized word for word by residents who treasured having something, however small, that connected them to a specific person outside the ward who still, in some form, thought of them. It is worth acknowledging, too, that not every former resident's account of this era is one of quiet resilience and hope. A meaningful number describe real and lasting difficulty, a sense of having been genuinely forgotten, an anger, entirely reasonable, at a system and at family decisions that shaped an entire childhood and adolescence, without ever asking for the child's own perspective on any of it. Both of these threads exist honestly within the record, sometimes within the account of a single individual describing different periods of their own long institutional life. Several former residents, interviewed decades later, describe something worth sitting with tonight specifically: a distinct memory, however faint, of a life before the institution, carried quietly for years, even by residents placed at very young ages, in the form of a fragment rather than a full memory, a color, a particular smell, a lullaby melody with no remembered words, a sense, difficult to fully explain even to the person holding it, that something had once been different and warmer and theirs. The adult residents who eventually left these institutions, whether through the deinstitutionalization movement we discussed in the previous chapter or, in some earlier cases, through family reunion arranged independently of any broader reform, describe the transition itself as its own significant and difficult experience, learning, often for the first time as adults, skills and routines of ordinary community life that the institution's own rhythms had never required or taught, alongside the very particular experience of encountering, or in some cases finally meeting for the first time, family members who had spent that same span of decades living an entirely different, entirely separate life just a short drive away. There is a phrase that appears independently in several unrelated collections of former resident interviews, different individuals in different states describing a remarkably similar feeling using remarkably similar language. The sense of having been waiting in some quiet corner of themselves the entire time, waiting to be asked what they remembered, waiting to be asked what they wanted, waiting simply to be seen as a whole person by someone outside the ward, rather than as a case number, a ward nickname, or a diagnosis recorded on an intake form decades earlier by a stranger who had known them for the length of a single brief examination. Several former residents in these more recent interviews have also spoken specifically and thoughtfully about identity, about how they came over the decades to understand and describe themselves, apart from both the institution's clinical vocabulary and the family narrative that had written them out of the picture entirely. A number describe a long, gradual process of coming to see themselves clearly, on their own terms, often only in later adulthood, once the language available to describe disability had itself changed enough to offer something more humane than the case file vocabulary they had grown up inside. It is worth noting, too, the role that fellow residents sometimes played in this process of self-understanding, functioning as a kind of chosen community in the genuine absence of the family community that had been foreclosed to them. Several interviewees describe specific older residents who effectively mentored them as children, teaching practical skills, offering comfort during difficult stretches, modeling a kind of resilient dignity that had nothing to do with any staff members' training and everything to do with one resident simply choosing to care for another. Music, in particular, appears with striking frequency across these later interviews as a specific and lasting source of comfort during institutional years. A hymn learned in the ward's Sunday worship, a popular song heard on a staff member's radio, a simple melody hummed by a favourite aide while working. These small musical fragments, several former residents report, stayed with them for decades afterward, carried forward into their later community-based lives as one of the few genuinely happy threads connecting their institutional childhood to whatever came after it. It is a quiet, patient kind of waiting, and it is worth letting it settle here for a moment before we move forward, because it belongs at the center of this story in a way the earlier chapters, focused as they were on parents and doctors and legal reform, could not fully capture on their own. This was never only a story about what families decided, or what a medical system believed, or what a piece of legislation eventually changed. It was, all along, also a story about individual children growing into individual adults, living entire individual lives, largely out of view and largely still hoping, in whatever quiet way each of them carried it, to be found. We have spent a great deal of tonight's story looking closely at the children in this history, and it would be an incomplete telling if we did not turn, gently, toward what became of the parents themselves in the decades that followed a decision most of them made in a single difficult afternoon and then lived with for the rest of their lives. The oral history record here is, understandably, thinner than for other parts of this story, gathered mostly from adult children reflecting on parents who have since passed away, or, in a smaller number of cases, from the parents themselves, interviewed very late in life, often for the first time, about a chapter of their own history they had rarely, if ever, discussed directly with anyone. What emerges from these later accounts is rarely simple relief and rarely simple regret, but something more complicated sitting quietly between the two. Many of these parents describe having genuinely believed at the time that they were making the responsible and even the loving choice, guided by medical authority they had little cultural permission to question. And many of these same parents describe, decades later, a persistent private uncertainty that never fully resolved itself either way, a question they carried privately for the rest of their lives about whether a different decision, made under different circumstances, might have been possible. Anniversary dates appear again and again in these later accounts as a specific, recurring marker of private grief: a birthday, the date of the original hospital stay, the date of that first drive out past the edge of town. Adult children, reflecting later on a parent's unexplained quietness on a particular day each year, frequently realized only after learning the full family history that this quietness had a specific, private cause their parent had simply never named aloud. A number of these parents, as they aged, made quiet, largely private efforts to reconnect or to at least confirm their child's well-being, efforts that rarely involve the kind of public reunion we will discuss in the closing chapter of tonight's story. A father driving alone to visit an institution decades after the initial placement, telling no one in his current household where he was going. A mother writing letters that were never sent, drafted and redrafted over years, kept in the same locked drawer we mentioned earlier in this story. These private, largely unwitnessed gestures suggest a persistence of feeling that the family's public silence had never actually managed to fully extinguish. Deathbed disclosures appear as their own distinct pattern in this history, described independently by a number of unrelated families in oral history collections. A parent, in the final weeks or days of a long life, finally telling an adult child the full truth of a sibling they had never known existed, often accompanied by a specific, practical request: find them if you can, or simply know that they existed and that they were loved, even from a distance that this same parent had spent decades unable to close. It is worth naming honestly that not every parent in this history carried this decision with visible sorrow. Some accounts describe parents who appeared, to their surviving children, to have made a genuine and lasting peace with the choice, rarely, if ever, revisiting it emotionally, having built a full and satisfying life around the family that remained visibly intact. It would be a disservice to this history to insist on a single, uniform emotional outcome for every parent who made this same difficult decision under the same difficult era's guidance. Marriage itself, within these families, sometimes bore a quiet cost that adult children later came to recognize only in retrospect. A particular tension between parents that had never been explained during childhood, a subject that visibly could not be raised at the dinner table without one parent or the other growing suddenly distant, took on new and clearer meaning once the underlying history finally came to light. Family therapists who work with adult children uncovering this kind of history describe this retrospective recognition, finally understanding an old, unexplained family tension, as one of the more common and more painful parts of the discovery process. There is also in this record a recurring and genuinely moving account of guilt transformed over decades into a different and more active form of care. A number of parents who institutionalized a child in the 1950s went on, in later years, to become quiet, dedicated volunteers or donors for disability advocacy causes, a pattern several researchers have noted without being able to say, in every individual case, whether the connection to their own earlier decision was ever explicitly acknowledged by the parent themselves. The pattern is suggestive nonetheless. Private grief finding an outlet in public usefulness, even where it could not find an outlet in direct reconciliation. For the families where this story never resolved before the parents' own deaths, the record left behind is often exactly what we described earlier. A locked drawer, an unexplained quietness on certain dates, a name recorded once in a family Bible and never mentioned again in living memory. These families inherited not a resolution, but a puzzle, one that some of them would go on, as we will see in the closing chapter, to spend real time and effort trying to solve. A smaller number of these parents, it is worth adding, took a considerably more active approach in their own later years, writing detailed private letters intended to be read only after their deaths, explaining the full circumstances of the original decision in their own words, rather than leaving it to be pieced together later from birth certificates and institutional case files. These letters, where they survive and have been shared by the adult children who received them, tend to combine genuine remorse with genuine self-defense. Parents explaining both what they regretted and why, at the time, the decision had felt like the only responsible one available to them. Adult children who received letters like these described them almost universally as a difficult but ultimately valued gift, imperfect, incomplete, but infinitely more than the silence that had preceded it for so many decades. There is one more pattern worth naming before we close this chapter, gathered from a number of independently collected accounts of aging parents specifically. A surprising number describe a shift late in life in how they spoke about the child they had institutionalized decades earlier, moving often quite suddenly in their final years from decades of near-total silence to a willingness, even an eagerness, to talk about that child openly, sometimes for the first time in the presence of grandchildren who had never once heard the name mentioned before. Several adult children describe this late-life openness as one of the more unexpected gifts of a parent's final years, a door that had stayed firmly closed for an entire lifetime, opening gently, almost without warning, near its very end. It is worth closing this particular chapter with a small measure of grace toward everyone involved, parents included. This was, by any fair accounting, an extraordinarily difficult decision made under significant institutional and cultural pressure by people who loved their children and were nonetheless told, repeatedly and with great confidence, that love required this particular sacrifice. Whatever they carried afterward, publicly or privately, resolved or unresolved, they carried it for a very long time and mostly, it seems, alone. Not every family in this story walked out through that wrought iron gate and left a child behind. A smaller number, against the steady current of medical advice and social expectation, brought their child home from the hospital and simply kept them there, choosing a far harder and far lonelier path than the one the pamphlet had offered, and living with the consequences of that choice for the rest of their lives. This decision, in the 1950s, was not simply a private one. It was, in a great many documented communities, a decision that carried real and ongoing social cost. Neighbors who meant well but understood little would sometimes suggest gently and repeatedly that the family reconsider framing continued institutionalization as the more responsible, more modern choice. Extended family occasionally treated the decision to keep a disabled child at home as a kind of stubbornness, even a mild embarrassment, at a time when public disability visibility of any kind was rare enough that a family raising a visibly different child in an ordinary neighborhood sometimes felt to those around them like a small breach of an unspoken social agreement. Schools posed their own, very practical obstacle, because in most states throughout the 1950s there was no legal guarantee whatsoever that a public school had to educate a child with an intellectual disability at all. Families who chose to keep their children at home often found themselves, as a direct consequence, also responsible for their children's entire education, informally and without support, teaching reading and arithmetic at a kitchen table because no classroom in the district was required or, in some documented cases, even willing to take their child in. It was out of exactly this frustration, parents raising disabled children at home, hitting the same wall of no available education, no available services, no available community again and again in town after town, that a small but determined movement began to take shape in the early 1950s. In 1950, a modest group of such parents met in Minneapolis and formed what would become one of the most consequential parent-led advocacy organizations in American history. An organization built explicitly on the premise that families should not have to choose between institutionalizing a child and raising that child in complete social isolation. Within just a few years, chapters of this organization had spread to dozens of states, each one founded by parents doing something remarkably simple and remarkably radical for the era: finding each other, meeting in church basements and living rooms, comparing notes on which doctors were actually helpful and which were not, pooling resources to start informal classes in borrowed rooms for the children that public schools would not enroll. It is worth sitting with how significant this was, a genuine grassroots movement built almost entirely by exhausted parents with no formal training in advocacy or organizing that would go on within a generation to fundamentally reshape American disability law. For the individual families involved in the earliest years of this movement, the daily reality remained difficult in ways that had little to do with the child themselves and everything to do with a world that had not yet built any infrastructure to support them. A mother raising a disabled child at home in 1954 might spend her days managing not only the ordinary demands of parenting, but the near-total absence of respite care, specialized medical guidance, adaptive equipment, or peer support of any kind. Resources that, decades later, would become standard and largely expected, but that, in this era, she and a handful of other determined mothers in her town were essentially inventing from scratch. There is a particular and often overlooked detail in the family accounts gathered from this resistant minority. Many of these parents describe experiencing real, unexpected joy in their day-to-day life with their child, alongside the very real hardship, in a way that quietly complicates the era's dominant medical narrative that institutionalization was simply the kinder, more merciful choice for everyone involved. These were not families who had somehow failed to grasp the difficulty of their situation. They understood it intimately, every single day. They simply also knew something the pamphlets and the doctor's offices had not accounted for: the specific, ordinary texture of loving a particular child, the small daily moments of connection that no clinical assessment of functioning level had thought to measure or mention. Community reaction to these families varied considerably by region and by decade. In some towns, a family that kept a disabled child at home found genuine, if imperfect, support from neighbors, from a sympathetic local doctor, from a church congregation willing to bend its Sunday school arrangements to include a child who learned differently. In other towns, the same choice brought a colder, more isolating response, invitations that quietly stopped arriving, a Sunday school that found reasons a particular child could not be accommodated, a birthday party guest list that year after year somehow never included this one family's children. It is worth noting, too, that the parent advocacy movement of this era did not confine itself to emotional and educational support alone. By the mid-1950s, chapters of this organization had begun actively lobbying state legislatures for changes that seem almost unremarkable to us now, and were, at the time, genuinely uncertain political propositions. Mandatory public education for disabled children regardless of institutional status, state funding for community-based day programs as an alternative to full institutionalization, basic standards of care and oversight for the state institutions that already existed. Progress on these fronts through the remainder of the decade was slow and uneven, but it was real, and it was being driven almost entirely by parents who had simply refused to accept that institutionalization was the only available path. One more detail from this history deserves mention here because it connects directly back to where we began tonight's story. Families who kept their children at home also necessarily kept them in the family photographs, birthday portraits, holiday cards, the ordinary visual record of an ordinary childhood, preserved intact in a way that the families in earlier chapters of this story were never able to preserve for the children they had placed. Looking back now at the family albums these resistant parents kept, researchers have noted how ordinary they appear, how unremarkable, full of the same birthday cakes and Christmas mornings and awkward school portraits as any other family's album from the same decade. That very ordinariness, in the context of everything we have discussed tonight, is its own quiet kind of statement. Faith communities, in a number of documented cases, played a genuinely significant supporting role for families who chose to keep their children at home, particularly in towns where formal medical and educational support was thin or non-existent. A sympathetic minister willing to adapt a Sunday school lesson, a congregation willing to quietly absorb the practical work of watching a disabled child for an afternoon so an exhausted mother could rest, a church basement offered rent-free for one of the earliest informal classes organized by the parent advocacy movement we discussed earlier. These small, local acts of accommodation, repeated across many towns simultaneously, formed an early and largely undocumented layer of community support that predated any formal state assistance by years, sometimes by decades. It is worth naming, too, the particular financial burden these resistant families often carried quietly and without complaint. Specialized equipment, private tutoring in the absence of public school enrollment, medical care not covered by any insurance program of the era, all fell to families who had, in choosing to keep their child at home, also implicitly opted out of whatever modest institutional funding the state might otherwise have allocated. Several family account collections from this era describe careful, ongoing financial sacrifice, a vacation never taken, a car kept running years past its expected life, a mother's own further education quietly set aside, made specifically so that a child's needs at home could be met without state assistance. It is worth mentioning, finally, the particular courage required simply to appear in public with a visibly disabled child in this era, a small daily act that these families performed without any particular fanfare, simply by going to the grocery store or to church or to the town park on an ordinary afternoon. Disability historians studying this period have noted that this quiet, unremarkable visibility, repeated across thousands of ordinary days in thousands of ordinary towns, did its own slow cultural work over the following decades, gradually normalizing, town by town, a kind of public presence that the dominant institutional model of the era had been quietly designed to prevent. It is worth closing this chapter with a small, specific image that appears independently in a number of these resistant families' accounts. An ordinary photograph taken at an ordinary birthday party in an ordinary backyard that simply includes every single child the family had, without editing, without careful seasonal planning around who would and would not attend a studio sitting. From this distance, decades later, it is easy to look at a photograph like that and see nothing remarkable in it at all. That, perhaps, is exactly the point. For the families who chose this harder path, ordinary was the entire hard-won achievement. This was, by every account, the harder road in the short term and the less common one. Most families, facing the same doctor, the same pamphlet, the same era's confident and mistaken certainty, made a different choice. But the parents who said no, gathering in church basements and living rooms across the country, quietly built something that would eventually help change the whole system for everyone who came after them. We will see in the chapters ahead exactly how that change finally arrived, not gradually in the end, but suddenly in a single television broadcast that the whole country happened to be watching. The system we have spent tonight walking through did not end quietly. It ended when it finally did begin to end, with a very public and very uncomfortable light suddenly switched on in a place that had spent decades operating almost entirely out of public view. By the early 1970s, a number of the largest state institutions built decades earlier were still standing, still operating, and in several documented cases, still housing populations well beyond anything their original architecture had been designed to hold. One such institution, a large state school on Staten Island in New York that had opened in the 1940s and grown by the 1970s into one of the largest facilities of its kind in the country, became the specific site where the wider public finally saw, directly and unmistakably, what decades of underfunding and overcrowding had produced. In January of 1972, a young television reporter working with a hidden key obtained from a staff member sympathetic to conditions he had witnessed inside brought a camera crew into the wards of that institution without prior authorization from administrators and broadcast what he found on the evening news. The footage showed conditions that had been for years largely unknown to the general public, Severe overcrowding, understaffing so extreme that basic care could not be reliably provided, residents receiving a fraction of the individual attention any reasonable standard of the era would have required. The public reaction was immediate and significant. This was not, by 1972, entirely unknown information within professional circles. State auditors and advocacy groups had documented similar conditions in internal reports for years. But there is a considerable difference between a written report filed in a state office and a television broadcast seen in a single evening by a large portion of an entire metropolitan region. The broadcast did what years of quieter documentation had not quite managed to do. It made the invisible visible all at once to an audience that had simply never had reason to look before. Legal action followed within a few years, brought on behalf of the institution's residents by a coalition of advocacy groups, including chapters of the same parent-founded organization we discussed in the previous chapter, the very same movement that had begun 2 decades earlier in living rooms and church basements. The resulting court settlement, reached in the mid-1970s, established binding standards for staffing ratios, living conditions, and individualized care that institutions of this kind had never before been legally required to meet, and set in motion a broader, gradual process of moving residents out of large state institutions entirely into smaller, community-based residential settings designed to more closely resemble ordinary family and neighborhood life. This shift, once it began, moved more slowly than its early advocates had hoped, constrained by the same problem that had shaped the whole system from the beginning: funding and the ordinary political difficulty of persuading legislatures to prioritize spending on a population that had spent decades being kept quietly out of public view and out of public mind. But it did move steadily across the following 2 decades, and the total population housed in large state institutions across the country declined significantly from its mid-century peak, a shift that would have been difficult to imagine from inside the crowded wards we walked through earlier tonight. Alongside this institutional shift came an equally significant legal change in education. In 1975, the United States Congress passed a landmark federal law guaranteeing, for the first time nationally, a public education appropriate to their needs for children with disabilities, regardless of the severity of that disability, and regardless of whether a family had chosen institutional or home-based care. This single piece of legislation did something the earlier decades of parent advocacy had been fighting toward directly. It closed the specific gap that had forced so many resistant families back in the 1950s to become their own children's entire educational system out of simple legal necessity. It is worth pausing to notice what this legal and institutional shift meant very concretely for families making the same difficult decision that our story's family faced back in 1953. A young couple receiving a similar diagnosis in, say, 1985 walked into a fundamentally different landscape: community-based day programs, rather than distant residential institutions as the default recommendation, legally mandated public schooling, a visible and organized parent advocacy network built by 3 decades of families who had come before them, and, gradually, a shifting cultural attitude that no longer treated visible disability as something a family needed to manage through concealment and distance. None of this arrived quickly enough for the residents who had already spent decades inside the older system by the time these reforms took hold. Adults who had been placed as infants in the early 1950s were, by the time of the Willowbrook broadcast in 1972, approaching their 20s, having spent their entire remembered lives inside institutional wards, with little or no ongoing contact with the families who had, decades earlier, driven away down that long county road and largely not returned. For many of these individuals, deinstitutionalization arrived not as a return home to a waiting family, but as a transfer to a smaller community-based group residence, a genuine improvement in daily conditions, but not in most cases a reunion with the family they had lost contact with so many years before. It is worth naming, too, what this reform movement did and did not accomplish. Conditions in community-based residential care, once the shift was underway, varied considerably in quality, just as institutional conditions had, and the transition itself was neither uniformly smooth nor uniformly successful across every state and every case. This is not a story with a single clean turning point after which everything simply became well. It is a story of gradual, uneven, hard-won improvement, driven largely by the same combination of parent advocacy and public exposure that had already been building quietly for 2 decades before that television broadcast finally brought it into full public view. But it was, unmistakably, a turning point nonetheless. The system that had operated largely unquestioned and unseen for the better part of a century was, by the late 1970s, operating under real legal oversight, real public scrutiny, and a real and growing expectation that disabled children belonged, wherever reasonably possible, in their communities rather than at a careful distance from them. The pamphlet with the soft pastoral name and the doctor's calm recommendation that had gone largely unquestioned in 1953 had, by the following generation, become something families were far more likely to push back against, armed with information, community, and legal standing that the parents in our opening chapters had simply never had access to. It is worth naming a few of the specific, concrete changes this reform era produced, because they can otherwise sound abstract from this distance. Mandatory staffing ratios, enforceable through the courts rather than simply recommended by an institution's own leadership. Regular, independent inspections of institutional conditions conducted by parties with no financial or reputational interest in finding conditions acceptable. Individualized care and education plans, required by law rather than left to an institution's discretion for every disabled child in the country, whether that child lived at home, in a community residence, or, increasingly rarely as the following decades progressed, in a large residential institution of the kind we walked through earlier tonight. The advocacy organizations founded decades earlier by parents meeting in living rooms and church basements played a direct, ongoing role in monitoring and enforcing these new standards, often serving as the very party that identified violations and brought them to legal attention. In this sense, the reform movement of the 1970s was not a separate development from the parent advocacy movement of the 1950s, but its direct continuation, carried out by the grown children of some of the same founding families, and by a new generation of parents who had inherited both the movement's institutional knowledge and its hard-earned skepticism toward any system's own self-reported conditions. It is worth noting, too, how this reform era changed the professional culture surrounding disability care itself, not only its legal structure. A new generation of physicians, trained in the years following these reforms, entered practice with an entirely different baseline set of assumptions than the doctor in our opening chapter had carried into that 1953 consultation room. Assumptions shaped by updated medical curricula, by the visible advocacy of the parent movement, and by a growing body of research demonstrating what community-based and family-based care could actually accomplish when given adequate support. The confident, largely unquestioned institutional recommendation that had shaped this entire story from its first pages gradually became, across the following decades, simply one option among several, presented with considerably more nuance and considerably less certainty than it had carried in 1953. It is also worth mentioning, in fairness to the era we have spent tonight examining, that public attitudes toward disability had already begun shifting gradually, even before the 1972 broadcast, driven in no small part by the 2 decades of steady, patient parent advocacy we discussed earlier. The broadcast did not create public concern out of nothing. It arrived into a cultural moment already primed by years of prior organizing to receive it seriously and to translate that concern into the kind of sustained legal and legislative action that a single news story, however powerful, could never have accomplished entirely on its own. It is worth closing this chapter by noting how much of this reform, in the end, rested on the same basic mechanism we have returned to throughout tonight's story: visibility. What had been kept hidden, in institutional wards, in family photograph albums, in a doctor's confident private recommendation, caused real and sustained harm precisely because it stayed hidden, unquestioned, unseen by anyone with the power or the standing to demand something better. What finally began to change it, across 3 decades of parent organizing and eventually a single television broadcast, was simply the slow, difficult, essential work of bringing all of it into the light. There is one more thread left in tonight's story, and it may be the gentlest one. What happened decades later when some of the families who had kept this particular silence finally found their way, quietly and often accidentally, back to each other. Before we return to the reunions themselves, it is worth understanding, briefly and gently, how this particular kind of family history gets uncovered at all, decades after the fact, once every parent who kept the original silence has grown old or passed on entirely and can no longer be simply asked. The paper trail, it turns out, was rarely as thin as families of the era might have hoped or assumed. A child placed in a state institution in 1953 generated, over the following decades, a surprising amount of official documentation, an intake form, periodic case notes, a state census record that, unlike a family Christmas card list, had no particular interest in maintaining anyone's carefully managed public story. Many of these records, sealed and largely inaccessible for decades under privacy statutes written to protect residents and families alike, have gradually become available to researchers and family members as those statutes have been revisited, state by state, in more recent years. Public vital records offer a second independent thread that a carefully edited photo album cannot erase. A birth certificate, filed with a state office at the time of birth, exists entirely outside a family's own private record keeping, immune to a pair of sewing scissors or a quietly updated Christmas card list. A grown grandchild researching a family tree decades later, working from nothing more than a name and an approximate birth year, can often locate a birth record for a sibling or aunt or uncle that no living family member had ever mentioned, simply because the state, unlike the family, had never had any reason to keep it quiet. Institutional death records add a third, often more difficult layer to this research. Many former residents who spent their entire lives within institutional and later community-based care are buried, in a documented number of cases, in institutional cemeteries. Modest, often poorly maintained burial grounds located on or near the old institutional grounds, where grave markers frequently carry only a case number rather than a name, a detail that researchers and disability historians in recent years have worked specifically to identify and correct, cross-referencing old case numbers against surviving intake records to restore actual names to graves that had, for decades, carried none at all. This particular restoration work, matching names back to numbered graves, has become its own small but meaningful strand of the broader disability history and advocacy movement in recent decades, carried out by volunteers, genealogists, and disability rights organizations working through institutional archives that, in many states, had simply been sitting largely unexamined in storage for decades after the institutions themselves closed or downsized. For living family members conducting this kind of research, the process tends to unfold in stages rather than all at once. An initial discovery, a birth certificate, a mention in an old letter, a name in a family Bible that does not match anyone currently known to the family, is usually followed by a much longer period of careful, patient searching through state archives, institutional records where they have survived and been made accessible, and, increasingly in recent years, genetic testing services that have helped a number of families locate living relatives entirely independent of any paper record at all. It is worth noting how recent much of this accessibility actually is. Many states did not begin meaningfully opening institutional records to family researchers, even under carefully controlled and privacy-protective conditions, until the last 2 or 3 decades. This means that a substantial amount of the reunion and rediscovery work we will discuss in the final chapter of tonight's story has happened relatively recently, well within living memory, even though the original institutionalizations themselves happened as many as 70 years earlier. There is a particular emotional texture to this kind of delayed research that genealogists who specialize in it describe consistently. Family members undertaking it often begin the process expecting primarily historical information, dates, places, the basic shape of a story their family had never told them. What they find, more often than they initially anticipate, is something considerably more personal. Photographs they had never seen, handwriting samples in old case files, small documented details of a relative's individual preferences and personality that transform an abstract historical fact into a specific particular person, with favorite foods and favorite songs and a specific way of signing their own name, however that name had been recorded on the ward. Disability advocacy organizations, including several with direct roots in the parent-founded movement we discussed earlier in tonight's story, now maintain dedicated resources specifically to help families navigate this kind of research, guidance on which state archives hold what records, how to request institutional case files where they still exist, and, in some documented cases, direct assistance connecting family researchers with former residents who are still living and who may themselves welcome the contact after decades of family silence. State-by-state variation continues to shape this research considerably, even today. Some states have moved toward relatively open access to historical institutional records for direct family members, provided appropriate privacy protections are observed for any living individuals named in them. Others maintain considerably more restrictive policies, requiring court petitions or lengthy administrative processes before a family member can view even basic case file information about a relative who may have died decades earlier. Researchers who work in this field regularly describe the frustration of a family finding, for instance, a death record confirming a relative existed and died at a particular institution while remaining legally unable, even so, to access the fuller case file that might explain the specific circumstances of that life. Volunteer-run cemetery restoration projects, mentioned briefly above, deserve a slightly fuller description here because they represent one of the more moving developments in this recent history. In a number of states, disability advocacy groups and local historical societies have organized volunteer efforts specifically to locate old institutional burial grounds, many of them overgrown and long forgotten by the surrounding community, and to cross-reference surviving numbered grave markers against archival intake and death records, restoring actual names to graves that had carried only a number for 50 years or more. Several of these projects have gone on to hold formal rededication ceremonies, inviting any locatable family members to attend, some of whom learn, through that very invitation, the first confirmed fact they have ever had about a relative's fate. DNA testing services, widely available only in the last decade or so, have added an entirely new dimension to this research that did not exist for earlier generations of family historians working this particular case. A number of reunions in recent years have begun not with a document at all, but with an unexpected match notification from a consumer genetic testing service, connecting two people who had no prior knowledge of each other's existence and no shared family story to explain the connection, until careful follow-up research uncovered the institutional history sitting quietly behind it. This technology has made a certain kind of discovery possible that simply was not available even 15 years ago, and researchers in this field expect it to continue reshaping how these particular family histories come to light in the years ahead. There is a final practical detail worth mentioning for anyone listening tonight who may recognize a piece of their own family's story in what we have described. Most state archives maintain a dedicated vital records or historical institutional records office, typically reachable through a simple written or online request, and a growing number of disability advocacy organizations now offer free guidance specifically for families beginning exactly this kind of search. It is, by every account from the researchers who do this work, slow and sometimes difficult, but it is, for the great majority of families who attempt it, genuinely possible in a way that would have been unimaginable even a generation ago. It is this specific, patient, often quietly bureaucratic work, archive requests, cross-referenced case numbers, careful searches through records that were never designed to be easy to find, that has made possible the reunions we will spend our final chapter with tonight. Not dramatic revelations arriving out of nowhere most of the time, but slow, deliberate acts of searching carried out by people determined to find a gap in their family's story and gently, patiently fill it back in. Let us return, one final time, to the family we have followed since the very beginning of tonight's story. To the small house that once had a room painted the pale yellow of 1953, and to the younger children who grew up inside it, never knowing about the space that had been so carefully edited out of their family's visual history. In stories like this one, gathered from genealogical researchers and family historians who have spent recent decades helping families uncover exactly this kind of history, the discovery itself tends to arrive quietly, almost accidentally, long after the parents who kept the original secret have themselves grown old or passed away entirely. A grown grandchild, building a family tree for a school project or a personal hobby, finds a birth certificate that does not match the family story they have always known. A death certificate, filed decades earlier at an institution none of the living family members recognize, surfaces in a digitized public records archive that did not exist when the secret was first made. The moment of discovery, described again and again in these accounts, tends to be less dramatic than one might expect and considerably more disorienting. Not a single thunderclap of revelation, but a slow, uneasy recalculation as a family member sits with a document that simply does not fit the shape of the family they thought they had, turning it over, checking the dates again, beginning quietly to understand. What happens next varies enormously from family to family, and it would be dishonest to suggest that every one of these stories ends in reunion or in comfort. Some institutionalized individuals had, by the time they were located decades later, already passed away, their lives lived out entirely within institutional and then community-based care, without ever learning themselves that a family existed beyond the walls they had grown up inside. For these families, the discovery brings a particular and unresolvable kind of grief. The grief of arriving, finally, at a door that has already closed. But a meaningful number of these stories do end differently, and it is worth spending our final chapter tonight with them because they offer something this whole difficult history has been quietly building toward. Genealogical researchers and disability advocacy organizations working together in recent decades have helped a number of families locate siblings, aunts, and uncles who had spent most of a lifetime in institutional and later community-based care and had, in a genuinely remarkable number of documented cases, been waiting in whatever way was available to them to be found. The reunions themselves, described in the handful of accounts that have been shared publicly, tend to be quiet rather than dramatic. A nephew and an aunt meeting for the first time in a community residence day room, neither one entirely sure, at first, what to say to the other, the decades between them too large to bridge with any single conversation. What tends to follow, in the accounts that have a happier ending, is something slower and gentler than a single reunion. Repeat visits. A birthday remembered finally by more than one household. A photograph taken at last with everyone in the frame. There is something worth sitting with in that image specifically because it returns us quite deliberately to where tonight's story began. A photograph taken decades late in which a person who had been carefully, deliberately edited out of their family's visual record for the better part of a lifetime finally appears again, standing among people who share their face, their history, their name. It does not undo the years that were lost. Nothing could do that, but it does, in its own small and late way, put something back that had been taken. Several of the family members involved in these later life reunions, interviewed by researchers documenting this history, have spoken about their own relationship to anger, the anger they felt understandably on first learning what had been done, and the way that anger, for many of them, softened over time into something more complicated, not forgiveness exactly, and not excuse. Something closer to understanding, an ability to hold at the same time real grief over what was lost and a real clear-eyed compassion for parents who had made an agonizing decision inside a system built deliberately to make that decision feel like the only responsible one available to them. It is worth remembering too the parents from our earlier chapter, the smaller number who said no, who kept their children at home against the current of their era's medical advice, and who, in doing so, quietly built the advocacy movement that would eventually help change the whole system for everyone who came after. Many of the reforms that made later reunions possible at all, better institutional record-keeping, legal recognition of disabled individuals' own right to family contact, genealogical resources built specifically to help families like these find each other, trace directly back to the organizing work those first parents began in church basements in 1950, work whose full consequences they could not possibly have foreseen at the time. The larger history we have walked through tonight resists a simple, tidy conclusion, and it would be dishonest to offer you one. Thousands of children were placed into institutions across this era under the sincere but mistaken guidance of doctors who believed they were offering mercy. Thousands of families performed the quiet, careful work of editing those children out of their photographs, their letters, their conversations with the children born after, carrying that particular silence for decades, sometimes for a lifetime. Some of those silences were eventually broken, gently, by researchers and grown grandchildren and patient genealogical work. Others never were, and will now most likely never be, the people who could have explained them, having already passed beyond any further questions. What we can say, with some confidence, sitting here at the end of this story, is that the world that produced this particular kind of silence has, in real and measurable ways, changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but changed enough that a family receiving a similar diagnosis today walks into a landscape built brick by the parents who came before them and refused to accept the terms they were originally offered, by the ones who kept their children in the family portrait from the very beginning, and by the ones who, decades later, cut a small paper corner back into the frame it had been trimmed from. There is one more kind of reunion worth mentioning before we close, quieter still than the family visits we have just described. In recent years, as institutional records have become more accessible and as disability historians have worked to restore names to the numbered graves we discussed in the previous chapter, a number of communities have organized simple, dignified memorial gatherings for former residents who died at these institutions with no surviving family ever located at all. These are not technically family reunions in the usual sense, but several organizers of these gatherings describe them, movingly, as a different kind of reunion nonetheless. A community, however unrelated by blood, choosing finally to say a person's actual name aloud, in the place where, for decades, only a number had been spoken. It is worth remembering too, as we close, that this history is not entirely in the past tense. Families today still receive difficult diagnoses. They still sit across from doctors delivering hard news, still face decisions about care and support that carry real weight and real consequence. What has changed, meaningfully, is the range of options available to them, the community support they can draw on, and the legal protections that did not exist for the families in our opening chapters. The specific shape of tonight's story, the pamphlet, the long drive, the small sewing scissors at the kitchen table, belongs mostly to a particular decade now closed. But the underlying question every one of these families faced about how to build a life around a child the world had not yet made room for is a question new families are still, in their own ways, answering today. It is worth remembering too that not every reunion story available to us tonight has a name attached to it in the public record, and that is exactly as it should be. Many of the families who have gone through this specific experience in recent decades have chosen to keep the details private, sharing only the broad shape of what happened with researchers and advocacy organizations while keeping the particular names, dates, and personal details for themselves alone. This privacy is worth respecting, and it is part of why tonight's story has been told throughout through composite scenes and broad documented patterns rather than any single family's specific identifiable history. There is a final detail worth including here, gathered from several of these later reunion accounts, because it returns us so precisely to where tonight's story began. A number of reunited families, in the months and years following their first meeting, have described the specific act of sitting down together and rebuilding a photograph album from scratch, not replacing the old, edited one, which many families choose deliberately to keep exactly as it was, gaps and all, as its own honest piece of family history, but starting a new one, forward-looking, in which every subsequent birthday and holiday and ordinary Sunday afternoon includes, without exception or careful cropping, every single person who belongs in the frame. If you find yourself thinking, as you drift off tonight, about your own family's albums, your own family's quiet, unexplained details, you are not alone in that. A great many people who first hear this history report exactly that same instinct, a quiet curiosity about their own family's past, about names that might have gone unspoken a little too consistently, about a relative mentioned once briefly and then never again. Not every such curiosity leads anywhere, but some of them do, and either way there is something worth honoring simply in the willingness to ask the question at all. Somewhere, in an attic, or a drawer, or the back page of an old album, there may still be a photograph with a gap in it, shaped exactly like a person. If you know where to look, and if you are willing to look gently, some of those gaps, it turns out, can still be filled back in. Let your eyes rest now, if they haven't already. Let the whole shape of tonight's story settle somewhere quiet in the back of your mind, the way a photograph settles into the back pages of an album. Not forgotten, just resting, ready to be found again gently, whenever you're ready to look. We have walked a long way together tonight, through a hospital consultation room, down a long county road, past a wrought iron gate, into wards that held both real hardship and real kindness, and out again, decades later, into kitchens where locked drawers finally came open and archives where numbered graves finally received their names back. It was never a simple story, and it was never only a sad one. It was mostly a story about ordinary people doing their best inside a system that too often asked the wrong things of them, and about what slowly, patiently changed. Picture, one last time, that small room painted the pale yellow of 1953. The window is dark now. The mobile of felt ducklings has long since been packed away. But somewhere, decades later, on a mantle or in a drawer or pinned to a corkboard in a kitchen none of us will ever see, there is a photograph with every face in it, taken late, taken gently, taken because someone, eventually, was willing to look for the gap and fill it back in. Before you drift the rest of the way off, here's a small, gentle question to leave with you, if you'd like to think about it. What do you imagine you would want someone, decades from now, to go looking for on your behalf? Let that settle, or let it go entirely. Either is fine. Sleep doesn't require an answer. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. And one last quiet reminder before I let you go. This whole story, and every other one in the library, lives on Spotify too as an audiobook, if you ever want to just close your eyes from the very first sentence. The link is down in the description and pinned in the comments. The house is quiet now. The album is closed. Wherever you are tonight, let this be the last thing your mind holds on to. Not the sorrow of this story, but its ending. A photograph, finally, with everyone in it. Rest well. You have earned it, and so, in their own quiet way, did they. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.